All right, we're going to get started here in a minute. All right, I'm going to call to order the meeting of the University of Minnesota's Board of Regents Finance and Operations Committee. And we are in session. I'll note that Regent Shu, I believe, is going to participate by phone. So we'll stop for a second and see if he's on.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Chair.
Very good. Thank you, Regent Shu. And with that, we have a quorum and we have lots of business before us. So we will jump right in. I'll also welcome our student representatives and look forward to hearing from both of you today. So thank you for being here and participating. The first item up is the resolution related to refinancing of debt for the Biomedical Discovery District. This is an action item. We had discussion on this in December. And Senior Vice President Burnett, any further comments on this?
No, we continue to believe this is a good strategy for the university, and we'd ask that you support our efforts in this regard.
All right, the resolution's in your materials, and if there, I'd entertain a motion to adopt it, and then we can discuss if we need to.
So moved. Second.
Very good. Moved and seconded. Discussion on the Biomedical Discovery Refinancing Resolution. Very good. Hearing none, then we'll move to vote. All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Very good. That carries. And to take up Regent Anderson's discipline, we'll carry that with a gavel wrap. So there we go. Item 2, the an administrative cost definition and benchmarking, an external review has been underway, and we now have an opportunity for discussion of that. And to kick that into gear here, I'm going to ask President Gable to lead the way. President Gable.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the committee, just as a reminder, the discussion around administrative cost benchmarking began last spring with a legislative bill requesting that the university define and explain our costs. We respect and hear this question, which was posed by our elected officials, and continued this very important conversation at the July board retreat in Faribault. And that conversation, as you recall, ranged from defining cost, engaging the legislature, creating efficiencies while driving quality, and also seeking third-party input in order to set our targets. So as an outcome of the retreat and all of the conversation that led up to it, and as a core university governance priority for this year, the board charged the development of a multi-year financial framework that, among other things, controls and explores administrative costs. So members of the board, we want to be prudent fiscal stewards. We want to make sure we find efficiency where we should, but also that we invest where we should. And today's presentation is an important step in our work to define those parameters and build an effective administrative cost strategy. So to this end, under Brian Burnett's leadership, we engaged Huron Consulting to conduct a high-level assessment of the university's operational efficiency and to benchmark our administrative costs for the first time in a very thorough and robust exercise against a set of peers. So Managing Director Dr. Andrew Laws and Mr. Kurt Dorschel, who's Senior Director in the Higher Ed Practice, are here today from Huron to share the details of their analysis, and I'm pleased to turn it over to them at this time and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. And gentlemen, if you'd introduce yourselves so we can interact with you with questions later, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you, Chair McMillan, President Gable. So I'm Andrew Laws. I've been with Huron for about 15 years. I've worked with about 60 universities. I lead the strategy and operations practice at Huron, and I'm certainly glad to be here today.
Chair McMillan, thank you. My name is Kurt Dorschel. I'm a senior director with our higher education practice. I've been with Huron for 13 years, and prior to that was an administrator at New York University. I've worked with several of the University of Minnesota's peers, including UCLA, Penn State, Ohio State, and the University of Wisconsin.
Thank you. Why don't you proceed, and then we'll engage the committee when you're done.
Great. Again, thank you for having us, and I want to thank Executive Vice President Burnett for the help that he and his team gave us in collecting data and understanding the context of this analysis over the last couple months. So what you have in your packet in front of you is essentially our full deliverable from our initiative. It's about a 60-page document. What we want to do today is go through about a dozen of those pages and kind of explain to you the approach and the findings that came out of that study. Our hope is to do that pretty quickly, and then we'll try and answer questions as best we can for any of them that you have. If we start on page 4, it kind of gives an overview, and what I would say is I think everybody in this board knows that the context is that costs are increasing in higher education, and that's a real policy challenge that we're facing. As stakeholders think about that, many stakeholders look to administrative bloat as a concern, potentially driving those raising costs. When we think about that, the question then becomes, well, what should our administrative expenses be? And then analysts quickly look at or request benchmarking data to justify what that is. And so that's kind of where we started with this initiative. We really thought about 3 things. So what is the general applicability of benchmarking in higher education? What is the applicability of benchmarking to the University of Minnesota? And then what does the data tell us once we do that benchmarking? To do that, we had to do a few things. We had to pick the right set of institutions. We had to pick the right data. And then we had to pick the right measures with which to evaluate ourselves on. If you think about kind of benchmarking in higher education, this is an attempted graph that shows the range of benchmarking that exists. If you were to have a greater appetite for the range of benchmarking later in the document on slide 51, we've made an attempt to kind of inventory all the different benchmarking analyses that Huron is aware of in higher ed and that we use for various initiatives that we're engaged for. Our inventory of those benchmarking studies and companies that provide benchmarking is 88 items long. Of those, the University of Minnesota participates in about 51 of those exercises. Now, as you might imagine, those were across a broad range of functions, lots of different levels within the organization. They look at many different attributes of the organization, right? Both mission related and administrative related. What we did for this study is to focus on 3 items. Those are kind of itemized out on page 6 of our document. First, we looked at audited financial statements. And so the benefit of the audited financial statement is they all follow very conforming accounting principles. And so you can get apples to apples comparisons. Another benefit is that you can pick the institutions they use because all institutions issue these statements. Another benefit is that the statements come out annually, and so you can get timely data with the audited financial statements. The challenge with the financial statements is you can only get high-level data. You cannot generally break the data down into mission elements or functional elements. And so if you're trying to really understand, the equivalent of your cost of goods sold or the administrative cost of the organization, it's hard to get there through the financial statements. The second set of data that we looked at is data collected by the Federal Department of Education. It's referred to as IPEDS data for Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data Set or something along those lines. It is good because you can, again, pick your institutions. Every institution in the country that receives federal financial aid has to submit data to the Department of Education, so everybody's in there. It also addresses one of the concerns of the financial statements in that you can get data on a functional and mission-based basis. So you can get to that level of detail. The challenges with the IPEDS data are they're generally 2 years in arrears. And so it takes the federal government some time to collect the data and put it in a repository which we can use. And the second concern is There is, unlike the financial statements, there's limited consistency institution to institution in terms of how they report. There's a set of rules that they're supposed to follow, but there is great variability in how institutions interpret those rules. And so there's data quality issues there. The third approach we used is looking at the what's referred to as the facilities and administrative rate proposal, or the indirect cost long form. What this is every institution in the country that does federally sponsored research has to submit a proposal to their federal cognizant agency. And that proposal follows a very strict set of accounting principles governed by the Federal Office of Management and Budget that says how they must account for costs, and they use that to justify the overhead costs that the federal government pays to institutions when they do research work. What you might can foresee is that is a good data set because it's consistent, it follows that common set of parameters, so you don't have the same quality issues. It is also good because, like iPads, it allows you to get to the mission or functional level of an organization. Okay. Of course, every one of these has a downside. The two downsides to these indirect cost proposals are institutions generally only submit them every 5 years. And so you can use it to look at ratio type data, but trend data or data where there's inflationary costs, it's hard to really get good information. The second challenge is that these reports are not publicly available. And so, for example, Huron was only able to use benchmarking data from institutions where we have filed their federal long form. And so you can't be as specific as saying these are the 10 institutions I want to benchmark on. Okay? So again, we've tried to take an approach that allows us to look at several different data sets and try and triangulate. We think together that will benefit the university and this board to help you think about what questions to ask and where to look further. But every set has limitations, and so what we recommend is that the benchmarking, of course, be used directionally, and in some cases you have to take it with a grain of salt. So next we move into the selection of institutions, and so none of you would be on this board if you didn't care deeply about the university. And with that care, I'm sure you can all describe how the university is different, special, how it's not like anybody else out there, right? That's true when we think about benchmarking as well. The university is a large research-intensive organization with a medical school. When we look at institutions to compare that with, we first look at 50 research-intensive institutions across the country. When we look at that, the research range is quite large. Number 50 does $516 million worth of research, and number 1 does $2.6 billion. That's a big range, about a 6 time variation, right? And so there's still a lot of complexity there. There's also complexity because some of those are public, some of them are private. The publics use FASB financial statements. The privates use FASB. The publics use GASB. Some of them are purely medically oriented, academic medical centers, right? Like the University of California, San Francisco, right? They don't have undergrad. It's just the professionals. So what we first did is we stripped away those that we didn't think were reasonable because of the institutional control, public or private, or because they were a primarily medically oriented institution. Okay? What that left us with was 31 institutions that now had a research range of about 500 to 1.6 billion in research. We don't have it here, but if you look at page 45 or 46 of your packet, you would see those institutions, the 31, et cetera, and some of the overall characteristics of them. We then tried to narrow down again based on institutions that were most like the University of Minnesota, and we came up with a peer set of 10 institutions that the university has commonly and historically used for these types of activities. And so you'll see us as we go through this cycle kind of back and forth between the 10 and the 31, again, trying to triangulate and give you the best data possible. So the next piece is the data variation. And so I feel like you've probably heard this ad nauseum, so I won't spend a lot of time on it. But the point is that the relationship with the state is different. The system level is different. The type of revenue streams they get are different. This all drives variation. For example, on the system level piece, UCLA is in your list. UCLA receives considerable services from the system office. The University of California Office of the President has an $890 million budget, and it provides services at UCLA. So UCLA's numbers don't include any of those kind of HR, procurement, IT services from the system. If we look on slide 9 and think a little bit more specifically, for example, Penn State is a good peer with respect to research expenditures, multiple locations, a medical school, but not an affiliated hospital or kind of a folded-in hospital. But as I mentioned, they report as a private institution using FASB, not GASB. Wisconsin-Madison is a good institution peer in terms of geography and a medical school without a hospital. But they have a system office. And they have spent a lot of resources. They just recently finished a 8-figure administrative transformation project about 6 years ago. It didn't go well, so now they're about to launch a 9-figure administrative transformation project. Those kind of investments make benchmarking data very difficult. Ohio State is good because they have 5 campuses. There's no system office. But the relationship that they have with the Western Medical Center has a lot of unique characteristics that are not like what we have with our School of Medicine. So again, I don't want to spend all my time disclaiming differences, but it's important that we recognize those. The last slide on this topic also just recognizes for every benchmarking metric, there's of course a numerator and a denominator, and there's variability in both sides of that equation, right? On the numerator, which is generally dollars, there's differences in level, variability, structures, and scopes. On the denominator, which is generally the activity side, there's variation in how data is captured, what the data definitions are, and how quality is impacted. And so again, don't want to spend all my time with disclaimers, but those are just super important factors to think about when we do benchmarking. So what you're really interested in is slide 11 and 12. These are the findings. We've broken our findings out into 2 categories. The first one has to do with the workforce, and there are 5 metrics there that we found notable. The page 12 is the financial categories, and there's 5 metrics there that we found notable. What I'd like to do is walk through each of those 10 now. So the first one looks at the university's mission-focused headcount. And I'm happy to report that there's only 2 institutions in the peer group that have a larger share of their headcount focused on the mission. And so these are your team members that are doing teaching, research, and public service. So what this tells us is that out of those 10 peers, so 11 institutions, including you, you were very close to the top in terms of putting your money where it should be, putting your money towards those mission-driven elements. The second piece is looking at the full-time and part-time overhead staff as a percent of total headcount. Okay, so the first piece was the mission heads. The second is your overhead. This is management, business, fiscal operations, and administrative. And so the reason these 2 don't add up to 100 is because we don't include like custodians, facilities, some of the auxiliaries, things like that. So we're looking at your mission folks, and then we're looking at your business or administrative folks. In this, you come in just below the benchmark. And so you have 26% of your workforce focused on these categories versus that group of 11 has 28% of their workforce. The range here is 17 to 36. And so you're essentially right in the middle at 26. The next piece I would look at is the growth in non-instructional staff. And so this is in terms of kind of it's expanding on that kind of administrative piece, but looking at how it's changed over the years. And your growth is below the median of your peers. And so it appears that you've done a very nice job of constraining growth in those areas. And so you're growing at 5.4% clip versus the peers at 6.8% clip. So it is notable that 2 of the peers have reduced that number. So they've had negative growth essentially, but 7 of the peers have grown faster than you and how they've added overhead staff over the last 5 years. Again, that tells me that you have growth in the right place. The next metric is looking at your manager level individual. So anyone with a responsibility over staff. And what we find here is that you have 1 manager per every 22 FTEs. And so you've got a healthy span of control from your management perspective. And this compares to a peer average. I'm sorry, my document says 14.9%. It's supposed to just be 14.9 period. That's not a percentage. But this is important because you have less managerial staff there and more essentially frontline workers who get to spend time with students, who get to spend time helping faculty, who get to spend time helping researchers, things of that, as opposed to managing. The last piece is occupational shifts, and this one's probably the most difficult to get your head around. It's a little nuanced, but in the past 5 years, we have seen the number of managers increase. That is still captured in the 20 FTE ratio just before, but we've seen that number increase from about 15%. But at the same time, we've seen your administrative staff decrease by 26%. And so what it appears to us is that you're doing a nice job of professionalizing your staff and getting people that can handle different types of work and do it in an efficient way. And so you've been trading out kind of 1 for 1.5 or 1 for 2 type resources from an administrative piece. So overall, our workforce summary, again, just appears quite positive and lots of positive trends. Each of those comments I made, of course, has a slide in the back with the data, the charts, et cetera. Slide 12 is where we get to the expenditure piece. The big takeaway here is that everything is within the range. None of the expenditures fell outside of the range. The first one we look at is the support cost as a percent of total expenses. We look at that from an academic support, student support, and institutional support perspective. In all of those categories, you're well within the range of your peers. More notably, I mentioned the IPEDS data is 2 years in arrears. So in all of those categories, you've also reduced costs from 18 to 19. He just told me 2 minutes left, so I'll go real quick. I'm sorry.
Just making sure you got the slide advance there.
The slide you're talking about needs to be up.
All right. So the next one is institutional support per enrolled FTE. This one, you are the 3rd highest, but you're within the range. Okay, so this is essentially the amount of finance, procurement, IT, HR, all of those types of items per student FTE. And so you're spending about $6,534, which again puts you within the range. There are only 2 institutions in the peer group above you. But what's unique here is that puts you at about a 35% premium. But when you factor in the students from all of the campuses, not just Twin Cities, the premium drops from 35% to 13%. So it does put you much more closer in that range, but both are in the range. Student services per enrollment FTE or per enrolled FTE, you are the median, and so you're at 2736. It is notable that this is the category that has had the fastest growth at Minnesota over the past 5 years. And my understanding is that is strategic and purposeful. I understand that the board passed a resolution in 2018 focused on student services and what we're doing in that area. So you're in the range there, you're growing it, and it appears to be an area of investment. Academic support per instructional, well, I need to say one more thing on the FTE piece, so the second and third column here. It's notable that your peers have been growing enrollment faster than you have, and so you would expect that their enrollment growth is also diluting their benchmark a bit as well, because your enrollment's been flat. You haven't benefited from some of those economies of scale, fixed costs, et cetera, and so that's another reason. Again, you're in the range, but you're kind of in the top 3 or 4 as opposed to the median. Academic support per instructional FTE. Again, there are 2 that are higher than you. You were third. Notably here, this is the category of expenditures across the university that has had the slowest growth since 2008. And so I do think there have been notable efforts to restrain this growth. And this has also declined since 2016. And so you're net down in that category, though you're still at the higher, in the top 3. Finally, administrative overhead cost. These are all the categories that roll up into that research submission that you send to the Office of Management and Budget. There are 11 categories. 3 are relevant to this study, all of which you're very close to the median, and you were within the range. One notable here is that if you do break it down in subgroups, even below the 11, you would find that while you're in the range for the overall cost, departmental administration, it puts you a little bit on the higher end. What's notable here is that we didn't get to pick the peer institutions. Remember, for this research piece, we had to use the institutions that we had. And so of the institutions we used here, only 3 of them have decentralized resource management models. The other 10 or so have centralized management models, and that does tend to shift administrative costs more to a departmental level. Again, you're not higher as the total administrative costs. It's just your percent of centralized admin versus decentralized admin is a little bit higher, which I think is reflective of that peer set because of the management models in place. So I'm a couple minutes over my 20 minutes of speaking, but I'd love to take questions if you have them.
Oh, you did a nice job walking through a fair amount of data and a fair amount of material for us to ponder before we open it up to the committee. I believe President Gable, did you want to make some more comments, or are you okay?
I'll defer, Mr. Chairman, until the conclusion of the discussion.
Very good. Let's have a little visit here about this. We'll start with Regent Beeson and then Regent Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, presenters, and thank you, President Gable, for taking a quick look at our cost structures with a third party. This is obviously just the beginning of that conversation, but I think it was timely, and there's some good information, both affirming information and some new approaches. The takeaways from this, I think, are that our operational excellence program has helped. We've moved $90 million from admin cost to mission. It shows up on our high mission percentage. It is really interesting that, we have to, it's almost a Byzantine type of approach in this industry about costs and trying to match and compare and using multiple data sets and struggling to find any comparability. So at the end of the day, I'm a believer we have to trust our own benchmarking. We've got, with our family study in place, and we've got some years behind us, we can really watch our own progress and our trends. So I think it's important to get these comparisons, but they are all asterisk. They're all conditioned on things. So I like our benchmarking. The one area that I fought two administrations, and I may fight this current one too, that we've never seen to make progress on, and that is centralization of our backroom functions. And, whether that's HR or IT or finance. So I want to ask the presenters, I mean, there's been enough years this has been talked about between centralizing, decentralizing. We're far on the side of decentralization. I know there's been some collaborations inside the university to centralize, but we're really on the decentralized side. So in your opinion, are we missing a material opportunity by not looking closer at a more centralized structure of backroom support? And what are the best examples you can tell us with all the years you've had about what's worked well with the centralized approach?
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Mr. Laws, Mr. Dorschel.
Thank you, Chair McMillan, Regent Beeson. We didn't spend a lot of time carefully studying the central versus decentralized mix. I think when I reference your decentralized nature, I'm thinking about decentralized financial management, not necessarily decentralized administrative structures, though they do tend to go hand in hand in some cases. What I would say is that for the last 5 to 8 years, there's been a pretty steady trend or consistent trend across higher education to decentralized financial management and centralized administrative services. A lot of times people hear those and think they're in conflict with each other, but they actually can dovetail quite nicely. There are, of course, trade-offs to centralizing the administrative structures in terms of service levels, and there's been a lot of case studies and purported successes of centralization without damaging service levels in recent years. That wouldn't have been an answer if I were sitting here in 2013. There were a lot of failed attempts and no real successful ones. My colleague may want to talk about some of the successful ones, but
I'd say, excuse me, the question of centralization is often a question of what I'd say service integration, making sure that processes work wherever they occur across the organization and actually defragmenting. So as Andrew had pointed out, this idea of professionalization, so people spending more of their time focused on one particular function, developing proficiency at that function, so that they're able to provide both better service and do it more effectively and more efficiently. So we've seen actually what I'd call hybrid models where you have central reporting but distributed location of people who are providing service, or you have joint reporting relationships or hybrid reporting relationships, all with that idea of making sure that the function itself is integrated end to end. So some of that is actually also enabled by technology. So several of your peers, and several of the institutions that we compared are undertaking these large technology projects, but they're also undertaking simultaneously projects that look at workforce and look at how those trends that we observed here related to workforce are complemented by changes in technology.
Not to pile on, but slide 9, for example, one of the bullet points on the right of each of those talked about transformations similar to that taking place at these 3 peers. And then slide 37, we give some quick case studies on some of that at other institutions.
All right. Before I move on here, I'll jump in because this topic is of considerable interest to me too. As I looked through the data, I found the system comparisons and the places where you use data from our peers that have a system office or not have a system office, very, very interesting, and I would say very consequential in terms of how valid the comparator is. But I see centralization and decentralization in places as well. We're providing centralized services to the system as a justification for why we might not score as well in a thing. And then at the same time, we're talking about how decentralized we are. So the value to me, and I don't know about the rest of the committee, but would be to get some kind of a level set for the University of Minnesota system and what is centralized and what isn't. So as we go forward and think about our strategic plan and get to the bottom of Regent Beeson's question, and that's probably more an issue for President Gable and Executive Vice President Burnett and the rest of the senior team than it is for Huron. But how do we deliver services? I think about things like, like legal, very centralized here. It's almost all done here with help on the branch campuses, but most of it's here. You look at transformations over time in places like philanthropy. They've been moving to a much more centralized back office function there, but I can't honestly tell you how centralized or decentralized we are as we move down that service, the range of services. So I think we'd benefit as a Board of Regents from understanding what is centralized and what isn't, to Regent Beeson's point. And then otherwise this can get real murky quickly when you start thinking about comparators. So probably a little bit of help there. But anyway, that's just your chair opining. Regent Anderson, you're next on the list.
Thank you, Chair McMillan. I'll just tell you, your work is right up my alley. I love data. The problem with data is you've got to figure out what it means, though. And I want to ask you if I'm going to give you some ideas of what I have taken from this, and then ask if that's where you think we've landed. I see in our workforce, we're putting money in the mission. That's good. I think on overhead, we're below the benchmark, but we also see a range of 17 to 36%, so there is room to improve. We have low growth of non-institutional employees. I think that's good. And then when we get to expenses, we see that compared to some of our median, or some of our peers, we're a little higher than the median in some things. But it appears the largest things are student services and academic support, which go to the mission. So it looks to me, with our employees, we're getting a lot out of our employees, like the 20 FTEs per manager. We're maybe paying slightly higher, but what we're paying slightly higher is going to, I think, things we want, student services and academic support. So in a nutshell, am I reading it right?
Mr. Laws?
Sure. Chair McMillan, Regent Anderson, I think you are reading it right. I share that interpretation. I mean, when we think about next steps, we tell people that they need to be relentlessly focused on their mission and their strategy and making sure that that's where the resources are going. And that's what it looks like is happening here. We think you need to do these periodic type checks as kind of a temperature check, but the real focus, or the more tangible focus, can often be on that trend line and what's happening within student services, what's happening within institutional support. That's where you can often make more tangible benefit or management decisions. And we've seen that since the 2013 work across the board in all of these trends. The third thing I would say is your interpretation of kind of how slide 11 and slide 12 match together was a head scratcher for us as well. In general, it looks like you are quite efficient and below the mark on all your workforce categories, and all your expenditure categories you are within the range but a little bit above the median, right? And so that would suggest that you are getting a lot out of your people, but your expenses are going somewhere, right? Whether that's salary or benefits or program, it could be the makeup of your people, right? It could be that you've got more senior managers than junior managers and things like that. So that mix could be driving it. It could be that you're using technology more. We, in the scope of our project, didn't get to dig that deeply, but I think your read of it is very accurate, and that's an important question to think about.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair McMillan, and I got 3 points, and I think they're related to your comments and Regent Anderson's. First, in the presentation, thank you for pointing out the limitations of the data sets used. I think that's really important for all of us to understand that we're really apples and oranges, but that's the best we have. Second is a question in that on the analysis, and maybe I missed it somewhere, are you using the system as a whole or Twin Cities campus? I notice on institutional support for enrollment FTE, you break it out, and so that would be a question. And then third, on the context of academic support per institutional FTE, you make the comment specific value of individual academic support activities should be considered, and would that apply across the board in any of these categories? And in reflection of your recent comments, is where you were headed? Next steps? Thank you.
Mr. Laws, Mr. Dorschel, either one of you?
Great. Thank you, Chair McMillan and Regent Davenport. With regard to the system versus the Twin Cities, anywhere that we use the Twin Cities, it has the TC label next to it. If it doesn't have that, it's everybody. And it does kind of vary a little bit, benchmark to benchmark, depending on data availability and what we thought the best applicability to that peer set is. But it should be delineated clearly on all of them. The other question's harder to answer. That's kind of our consulting speak, right? The value of academic support should be considered, right? The value of any investment should be considered. So I would certainly say that's appropriate. I think what we're trying to get to was the point that Regent Anderson said, which was, these are the places we want to spend our money, right? It's students and academic support. And so I think maybe we're being too tongue-in-cheek there, but what we're trying to point out is that may be a good place to spend money.
If I could just add to that, maybe linking to your first point in terms of the data, that category, as well as all of these categories, what's included in it and how institutions divide costs across those categories can vary quite a bit. And so I think to that point, understanding what costs are actually being attributed to academic support and understanding not just are they appropriate from an accounting standpoint, but are they actually also serving the value of that in terms of mission support.
Regent Swigum.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Regent Laws and Regent Dorschel, I'm going to be very unfair to you and publicly very unfair. Regents. I'm going to put it like this. In reading through the numbers and statistics and the benchmarking, which certainly, Mary, is very, very difficult considering the differences and the changes in job classifications and the different peer institutions, my takeaway is that we're pretty close to the median. We compare it to our peer institutions. A little higher in some cases, a little lower in some cases, but we're not outstanding one way or another as far as the percentages and the numbers. So, Regent Laws, here's the unfair question I'm going to give you. Suppose you were in a situation of having let's say a $4 billion budget. And suppose that you were in the position of not getting additional revenues to that $4 billion budget from your major institution, the legislature. And suppose that you didn't think you should be raising tuition. You've heard the problems of student debt. And suppose the next thing on the agenda is some approval of some contracts with our wonderful employees, which is going to cost us some more money, $40 million more, whatever. Give me the numbers in here that you've given me that show me that I should go to President Gable and say, we're not getting any more money. We can't raise tuition. It's going to cost us some more money for our wonderful employees. Show me the numbers here, Regent Laws, that tell me that I can do something with administrative costs, that there is something that I can do from a standpoint of whether numbers of employees, trying to address it through attrition, something I can do, Regent Laws, to recognize those three other variables I gave you that are squeezing us.
Sure.
And it's unfair. I understand that. But give me the couple of things I can point to President Gable and say, President Gable, we've got to act.
Right, former Director Laws, now Regent Laws.
You've been promoted.
You have a tough. Mr. Laws.
Thank you, Chairman. I certainly agree with your sentiment. Just because we are within the range doesn't mean we just get to throw our hands up and say we're done, there's no work to be done, right? The environment is changing, demographics are changing, there's tremendous pressure on us and we have to act. And so So I spend a lot of my days helping institutions ferret out costs within the organization, and I've been doing that for a long time, and the way that works has changed in the last 5 to 10 years. Essentially, everyone in higher education has been in this period of contraction and cost cutting for a decade, since the Great Recession began in October of 2008. What that often means is that now when you look for costs to cut, you don't look for inefficiencies and fat. You look for the things that are the least important and the least mission critical. I would suggest that to an extent, everything we do at the University of Minnesota is important and it's valuable. But some of it is not as important as others, and some of it is not as valuable as others. And so I would use the strategic plan to drive that. I would look at trend lines such as what's on the data on slide 42 that shows how our different cost categories are increasing and decreasing, and say, is that where our money should be? There was a period from 2015 to 2017, for example, where we increased our expenditures on public service by $50 million. Is that something we could afford to do? Now, there's since been changes and we've reduced that, right? But those are the kind of things that I think we are required to look at and required to spend our time on, because it's not as easy as it was in 2007, where we could look at a benchmark, cut the fat, and go on to the next topic. We have to make the hard choices about what's most strategic and what's not. And I think you do that through a trend line.
Good response, Mr. Chairman.
A quick follow-up, Regents Wiggum.
Don't need to.
Okay, all right. Good. I thought you said a quick.
No,
were asking
I said
me.
good.
Very good. Well, if you want to keep your regent title, we'll speak afterward, okay? I've got 3 regents left that want to speak, and we're technically 5 minutes left to go, but this is an important topic. I also want to ask Regent Hsu if he had anything to say before I wrap up with the other regents. Regent Hsu, anything on the phone there?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, presenters. I understand you are limited by the data, and I appreciate you going through that at the beginning. Saying we're doing well against our peers is not really the right question for me. And I do appreciate your reference to the strategic plan, which should help us focus in the future. The big question I have is, where do you see the greatest opportunities to save money based on what you've seen? And then which of our peers are actually most efficient? It's not clear from the presentation. And then lastly, did you consider rankings of our peers in your analysis?
Mr. Laws, Mr. Dorschel, let's see, opportunities to save, rankings, and efficiency. Covered the gamut there, didn't he?
Yeah. Chairman, are you sure we still have time? I think we're over right now.
Oh, please.
Chairman, thank you. Regent Hsu, thank you. We I'll start kind of at the back. We only considered rankings with respect to how do we pick the peer institutions. And so that kind of came into account when we selected the 10 that we landed with. In terms of who is the most efficient, we get asked this question a lot, and we simply have not identified and don't know that it's possible to identify an institution that's got it all right. There are certainly people that are doing human resources right. There are people that are doing procurement right. There are people that are doing finance right. But in many cases, you have to get down to that level. And in many cases, it's the leadership of those various units that are just able to drive it with innovation. certainly we can provide functional case studies if there's interest in some of those things at a future time. In terms of where there are savings, again, the benchmarking did not shine a flashlight or send up a red flag or a flare on any metric that suggested there was a great deal of savings, right? There are points of interest in the benchmarking, right? I talked about departmental administration. We talked about the unique circumstance where you are very efficient on a headcount basis and appear to be efficient on a financial basis, but those are not necessarily in line. So are there pieces there where there are efficiencies to be had or tough decisions to be made? And then the last point, again, and I apologize if this is too much of a kick the can, but again, I would have to become much more familiar with your strategic plan to say where I would make cuts, because I think you're going to have to cut the things that are least important than other things if you want savings.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Mayeron.
I think most of my questions have been answered, so I just want to make sure I understand one conclusion, as it were, that's set out in your report, and that is on the analysis summary having to do with expenses. I'm looking at slide 12. It says, while the University of Minnesota Twin City campus was higher than the peer median by some metrics of overhead spend, this is likely mitigated by support provided across the campuses. And when I read that, it looked like, number one, that the analysis of expenses was may have been confined to the Twin City campus as opposed to system-wide. So I wanted to confirm if that was the case. That's probably a follow-up to Regent Davenport's question. But second, the conclusion or the comment that this is likely mitigated by support provided across campuses, I wanted to make sure I understand what the basis of that comment was, given, as I understand it, other peer institutions you're looking at also had they were system-wide campuses where there are a number of campuses that are being supported perhaps by a central administration. So, or is it possible there are other explanations for these where we're higher than the peer median?
Thank you, Regent Mayeron. It was that language exactly that caused me to react to Regent Beeson's question about, it sounds like we're very centralized then, and we're using centralization to, differentiate ourselves, but I don't know. So, Mr. Laws?
Yeah, Chair McMillan, Regent Mayeron. The details behind that statement are on slide 27, but I think your understanding of it is correct. Essentially, what we're saying is that the numerator includes dollars that support everybody, but our initial use of the denominator for student FTEs only included the Twin City campus. And so if we do that, we show a 35% premium. So we spend 135% the peers, which is still within the mark, but high within the mark. If we change the denominator to also include the students at the other the other campuses, and we do our best to ensure that the numerator also has their expenses in it, because their ratio is lower, the premium goes down to 113%. And so, again, you are within the range and better within the range. And so, since some peers are different, some are comparable to Twin Cities and some are comparable to the whole university, and so we just showed both metrics.
Just to follow up and clarify on the analysis, we did not do that same corrective for, say, Penn State, which has the 26 campuses, and then World Campus, which is their online programs, nor Ohio State, which has multiple campuses as well. Those would be the closest in terms of what I call operating model. So to understand how much of the adjustment should be attributed to that would be a follow-up analysis.
Thank you.
All right, good discussion. Regent Kenyanya?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I won't reiterate the question. I had the same question. Seeing the Twin Cities in there kind of threw me off as I was looking at it as a system analysis. But I will just agree with your earlier comments that going forward, that in terms of that centralization conversation, I'd certainly love to see or understand how far along that line we are, and specifically where, there's system roles, but then, what percentage of that is system? And if we were to attribute a number or dollar number to that, I mean, how much would we be attributing? But yeah, so.
Thank you. Okay, last Regent input here from Regent Powell, and then I'm going to let President Gable wrap us up.
Thanks, Chair McMillan. So I think it's clear we're sort of middle of the pack, and there's a very strong desire that you're hearing among this board to continue to pursue, aggressively overhead and admin efficiency. So let me ask the question maybe in a different way, because it sort of gets to best practice. Do you have thoughts on, what are the best ways to organize internally? Geographically, what kind of capabilities do you need? I mean, are there some best practices for institutions that really want to go after this? And I would clearly place us there. Smart things that we can do to organize so that we can do this in innovative and smart ways.
Mr. Laws. Or do you prefer Regent Laws? Do you like that? The legislature's in session. We can head over there and get you elected.
Thank you, Chairman Regent Powell. We have in some of the other analysis we do, we have a spectrum of kind of different modules or approaches to centralized and decentralized, and really we often don't even call it centralized because centralized strikes such fear in the campus to think about we're going to take their resources away and put them centrally. We often see institutions talking about shared services models, or even those have gotten such a bad name that people just talk about service delivery and how do we optimize service delivery. And so generally what that means is going function by function around campus, inventorying where activities are happening, and moving to more of a professionalized model, which is what we believe the university has already begun working on. The workforce analysis that is underway, and that shift that we talked about on slide 11, where we've seen the managerial staff go up and the administrative staff go down. Those are the types of things that we see organizations do. I think the team deserves credit for already moving down that path, but I'm certain there's plenty of a road left to cover because we're going to be forced to be more efficient. But that's how we think about it, and that's what we think the best practice is.
Go ahead, Mr. Dorschel.
Just to add to that, I think that idea of the primary costs are people. This is a talent-driven organization, and so having good, reliable data over time to understand the workforce and those programs to appropriately compensate and appropriately measure performance of people are really a foundation. So whether it is a centralized model or a shared services model or their service delivery model, in all of those cases, we need to make sure that workforce is aligned with the services to be delivered.
Okay, thank you.
All right, President Gable, thank you and Executive Vice President Burnett for getting this started. Obviously, the board interest here is high, and thank you both from here on for being concise and packaging the material, getting it to us, and you can tell there's tremendous board interest. So, President Gable, you get the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Of course, I add my thanks to Dr. Laws and Mr. Dorschel for the work they've done, and Senior Vice President Burnett's work in helping us launch this project, which, as we've discussed, is a first step in the board charge over a multi-year framework. I just want to highlight my appreciation for entering into a conversation that already had several years of leadership by this board and campus leadership from the highest levels of management to the frontline work of our most important employees and shifting our emphasis to mission. Which is, of course, what we're about as a mission-driven, multifaceted organization. I look forward to digging into this a little more as the strategic planning process unfolds, which we'll have the chance to do to some degree tomorrow, and of course in the future as that conversation unfolds. But I want to express my appreciation because one of the things that this data shows is that our people are doing a lot and in very different ways, and we're grateful for what they do, from the bottom up in every function of what we do, and from the top down in every function of what we do, because we're mission-driven and can't do it without them. So at that point, I look forward to future discussion and future meetings down the road.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you both. So I think we're going to have Associate Vice President Tonneson, Assistant Vice President Carlson join us for a recurring but very consequential topic for long-range financial planning. And while they're coming up, Executive Vice President Burnett, I don't know if you want to, or Senior Vice President Burnett, I just promoted you. There's a lot of that going on today here, right? Do you want to get started, or do you want to wait for them to get here? Because I know you've got some introductory remarks. So
while they're sitting, Mr. Chairman, thank you. While they're sitting down, I'll be glad to tee this up. This is an important discussion for this university, and actually follows naturally, I think, with the discussion we just had about mission and where we're putting our dollars. We're fortunate, in my opinion, to have two seasoned finance professionals, Associate Vice President Tonneson and Assistant Vice President Carlson, to walk through this presentation. And after their presentation, we'll be happy to take questions and discuss this information, because it's very consequential to the future of this university and the mission that is so important. Thank you.
And Julie and Link, thank you for your patience. I know you got bumped off this conversation once already, and now we have the time that it deserves. So please proceed, and I know the board's ready, or the committee's ready to jump in and dialogue with you afterwards. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, members. We will start this morning with focusing in on the long-range financial planning aspect of the presentation. We have often talked about the long-range financial planning exercise as one of the components of the regular budget process. We can use it as a way to view our recent financial trends and what that trajectory would look like if it continues in the same way, which also sets us up then for a conversation about what variables in the budget can be purposefully adjusted to modify that trend, and specifically how the choices for the budget can be shaped in the context of these long-range projections in ways that allow you to indicate what your priorities are and how we can work toward addressing those, including implementation of a strategic plan. And we'll start this conversation with just a very quick reminder of what the FY21 budget variables are that we first highlighted in October. Through the decisions we make on how to move forward with these variables, we can then impact the financial projections, perhaps with intent. This slide puts before you the 5 general spending categories we talk about with each year's budget, with some of the expenditure variables and values that we discussed in October. I won't spend time going through these in detail right now, but you will see that they are components of the long-range projections, which we'll show you in a few minutes, and they are items that will require decisions or attentions more specifically in the FY21 budget. So we'll return to them near the end of this agenda item. In October, we also talked about 4 major resource categories. Each of these play a role in the projections, in developing the trend view, but also in setting up choices for us as we look to the future. The state appropriation and tuition are unrestricted resources. They can be used to cover all costs of the institution. We have choices to make in pursuing state support and in setting tuition rates and enrollment goals, etc. Clearly, we also have choices to make in how much we want to force internal reprioritization of existing resources to fund needs and to fund new strategic investments. I've mentioned in the past that we've done some level of this almost every year, so how do we want to build that into our long-term plans? And then finally, for the other revenues, there is actually a mix that leads us to break this bucket apart a bit for purposes of our long-range projections. As I'm sure you remember, the revenues depicted in the green groups are those that, again, are unrestricted and can be deployed in discretionary ways. The yellow represents the auxiliary income, that used to support our businesses, but generally not to create a profit for the purposes of discretionary use. And then there are the red categories of revenue, the restricted funds that must be used in accordance with the direction of the sources of those funds. For purposes of the projections we're going to show you here momentarily, we have excluded that yellow auxiliary and the red restricted categories. Our goals remain to generate auxiliary funds in amounts that cover their associated costs plus some amount of overhead, and to generate increasing levels of sponsored research research awards and gifts and so forth to support a wide variety of programmatic goals, but we do not use those funds in the same way as the unrestricted sources in balancing the budget, so they do not play the same role in the financial projections.
Good morning. For Regents I haven't had a chance to work with yet, my name is Lincoln Carlson. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Institutional Analysis. I always joke that means I count things for the university. And it's always good to have external consultants show sometimes how hard it is to count things for the university. But so I appreciate that. But a lot of the work my office does, and I do personally, is work with Julie in the budget office on all sorts of financial modeling and things like that. So we've done this for quite a while. I'd also just say especially for new regions, that we've been doing some form of this analysis on a regular basis since about 2009. It was really driven by Regent Emeritus Clyde Allen, Regent Emeritus Frobenius, and Regent Beeson was the third regent in that room. Must have been your first year even. And Chair McMillan, certainly in his as chair of the board and chair of this committee, has always made sure that this item is on the agenda. So this is not the first time we've been looking at this. What we're going to show you today is, I'm going to jump right to the tuition revenue slide. We're going to show you really two projections, as Julie mentioned. One is really a straight annual growth trend based on our actual past 6-year trend lines. It's a nice section of time to look at now because we really have lost a lot of the noise that was part of the Great Recession, budget fluctuations in most, not all categories. We'll point out one where that's not true. And then really, Julie and I sat down and looked at all the variables that we look at and say, are there certain variables where we might want to make a projection adjustment of one type or another, and we'll talk about those as we go. But so you'll see both straight trend line and then perhaps a more conservative model. Tuition is our single biggest revenue source right now, and as I always remind people, that tuition revenue is a rate times volume, or tuition rate times enrollment discussion. So the FY20 budget is, in this case, is our actual FY20 numbers for fall enrollment and tuition rates. I would note, and the previous presentation alluded to it, over that 6-year period, though we have grown some parts of our student base, others have fallen. We are actually down just a bit over 500 students overall between 2013 and 2019. We have slightly fewer reciprocity students. We've had enrollment decreases collectively in our greater Minnesota campuses, and graduate and professional, primarily graduate student levels have dropped. In the tuition, you can see our current rates and the compounded annual growth trend for each of those categories. In this area, we've suggested a couple projection adjustments. One is the expectation for the number of Twin Cities undergraduate NRNR students. If we continue to grow at 1.8% a year for the next 6 years, we would end up with over 7,000 NRNR students as opposed to the 6,200 we have now. That's not in our current Twin Cities enrollment plan that Bob McMaster presents to you. So we've modified that. We'll also suggest that we may want to modify, or at least consider modifying the projection around the Twin Cities undergraduate NRNR rate. If we continued to go at 9.5% a year, which is what we've done on average over the past 6 years, we would end up with an NRNR rate of about $54,000 versus the $31,000 we have today. If we modified that for 5%, we'd end up about $42,000, probably still be in the middle of the Big Ten. Those are obviously board policy decisions. This is just for modeling purposes. On the other revenue trends, our state appropriation has grown on average 2.1% over the past 6 years, but as you well know, that is not orderly. Some years we do very well. There was some reasons to remember some of the early investments in MinDrive, where there was additional resources provided. This year, we are receiving a full addition of $1.7 million, just as examples. The other interesting category here really is in sales and services, which is a wide variety of things at the university, right? We extension sells brochures. Our College of Education and Human Development has actually been very successful in selling educational software to K-12 places all over the map. But overall, up 2.9% year over year. Just being the conservative budgeteers we are, we said maybe that might go back to some sort of inflationary trend line. We can talk about that, but also realize that is very different amongst different units at the university and their ability to have external sales and services. On the expense side, again, as we talked about, our basic expenses and our people and our compensation, and that is both a function of how many people we have and what we're paying them, both in terms of salary but also in terms of fringe rate. Year over year, we have increased the overall employee headcount by just under 1% a year. A couple things to remember about that. Only about half of our workforce is really on unrestricted funds, the green money. But that has also grown at about that 1% level. If you looked at that year over year, what you would see is there were some years, especially in 13, 14, and 15, where we were adding 500 headcount a year. A lot of that was coming out of the Great Recession. Units held positions open, and as finances stabilized, they filled those positions. I just grabbed the numbers this morning, anticipating Regent Sviggum's questions. For this year, from 18 to 19, the university added 30 headcount in total. And in that 30 headcount, there was a decrease of 109 positions for positions fully funded on O&M. There was an increase of 94 positions that were fully paid on restricted funds, almost all federal grants and contracts, and then an increase of 45 that were a mix of O&M and restricted funds. So down 109 in fully O&M year over year. A vast majority of the increase was in the medical school and in the research areas. The one modification we put on this slide was really around the fringe rate. This university has done a remarkable job of holding down, especially healthcare costs over this 6-year time period. Julie and I just wanted to see what would happen if that went back to sort of national averages over the next 6 years. So that's what that 3.6% is. And then a variety of other expenses that we trend out. The places where we made modifications, utilities is another place where this university has just done tremendous work, in my opinion, just looking at trends to try to constrain utility rate growth. You know, nationwide, that is a very volatile area, and it's volatile for us as well. You can have a polar vortex year, and you can have a more mild winter, and have two very different profiles. We just set that back up to national averages for the trend line alternate. And then we saw decreases in professional services and equipment. Again, those are small but volatile areas. The professional services one is almost certainly we were coming out of our enterprise system upgrade at the start of this 6-year trend line. And so I'm sure we had professional services going on here above and beyond what we would regularly have. So I don't think it's likely that decrease will happen forever. And equipment too, very volatile. Some years we buy really the biggest magnets in the world for MRI research, and some years we don't. And then there's a set of expense categories that you talk with Senior Vice President Burnett, Associate Vice President Thomason all the time in the budget building process. But all of these expenses are really buried in those previous expense categories that we just talked about. So I just want to recognize that they're there, but we're modeling them as part of additional people or less professional services or whatever that might be. So when you add all those up just on the trend line, not making any of those projection adjustments, just taking the last 6 years and projecting to the next 6 years, we look at how much additional revenue does that all generate and how much additional expenses that all generate. And this is the result of that crude, but we can get into as much detail as we need to, trend line. And it sort of shows that if everything goes to trend, except for in FY21 where we have less state support, but if everything stays in trend, we end up with revenues exceeding expenditures by about $10 million, give or take. And so you might ask, why does Julie come to you every year and say, why is there we have to fix this budget problem? And I think the answer to that is, yeah, Julie, why?
Yeah.
Of course, not every revenue or expense category stays on trend every year. And even if they do stay on trend over the entire university, they may vary amongst different units. So we may meet overall enrollment targets, but a college or a campus might not meet theirs, and that causes budget issues. We might maintain a salary pool, a compensation pool of X, but we have labor negotiated contracts that might be Y. So, and that spreads differentially over the university. So often what the budget problems that we're solving, some are global and some are local. And we'll talk about those in a little bit. Alternately, if we went with all of those more conservative projections that we talked about, you'd see a picture like that, where we are consistently about $10 million short just to start every year. And I would tell you, when I saw these pictures, we just do the math first and then look at the pictures later, that gave me some confidence that we're understanding the levers, because in any given year we might be $10 million to the good or bad if everything stays reasonably on trend. But there's always lots to talk about, even just within that $20 million swing, but also some external, thinking about bigger external shocks or bigger strategic investments. And Julie will take some of that.
I was going to say, I'll take that $10 million any year. Give me a $10 million problem. So in looking at the data, we thought it actually might be helpful to propose a bit of a structure for how you think about this and connecting it to the budget, and how they can apply not only next year but into the future years. There's obviously multiple paths you could follow and ways to incorporate this information into planning, but as we discussed it and thought about it, there were really three practical applications that started to take place or to take shape. One is closing a budget gap every year that Lincoln just showed you. A second is addressing any unplanned disruptions in the budget. And a third one is actually making decisions that would purposefully alter the trends that you see in the projections. So we were going to talk about each of these briefly, but in the interest of time, they are outlined in your docket materials, so we thought perhaps we could skip the slides right now, move past those for the time being. The real point here is that as you think through the kind of questions we put before you each year, you could organize those thoughts within the context of these long-range projections and then those three types of themes I just mentioned. So first, what will it take to close the budget gap that we just showed you, but do it in a strategic way that strongly addresses priorities and sets us up for implementing a system-wide strategic plan? Second, are there any external disruptions to our budget that you believe we should be prepared to address in the near future? And then third, is there a strong rationale to make what I would call a big and bold modification to the budget over time that could change the trajectory of the trend? And we can talk about any of those when we get to the conversation after the presentation. The President and her team will be considering these same questions actually as we develop the FY21 budget recommendation and as we plan for the next biennium. But your input today and over the next months will help inform that process. Transitioning now or turning now to talk in a more focused way about the FY21 operating budget that will be before you in May and June and the more immediate choices that are before us. As I mentioned at the beginning of this agenda item, we laid out various cost and resource variables that we will be addressing in this transition year budget for President Gable. It is the second year of the biennium, so we have some certainty in terms of the state appropriation, and we actually started the process with a general framework related to tuition, internal reallocations, compensation, and so forth. It's now time to assess any necessary changes to that basic framework as we work to close the gap using the financial projections that we just referenced. It is actually a very iterative process of asking and answering questions about what to plan as the incremental changes for each major resource and expenditure category. The types of questions outlined here. We know what our state appropriation is for next year, but what are our goals for tuition rate changes and internal reallocations? What's possible in terms of growth in other revenues, or where are there challenges in that arena? What are the goals for the salary increases and addressing strategic initiatives and so on? The first or second time through in answering these questions generally leaves us with an imbalanced budget. So we have to go back and make adjustments until the final plans balance the budget in a way that addresses the university's goals in the very best way possible. So that's the charge. How do we attack that? Most of the conversation for next year's budget centers around planning for the O&M and tuition-supported part of the budget. We don't forget about the red, yellow, and light green sections of this pie chart. And in fact, they bleed into conversations regularly depending on the unit we are dealing with. At this time of year, pretty much daily. But the major strategic choices are focused on the $1.6 billion of O&M and tuition. So let's discuss just for a bit what is happening with that portion of the pie. First, with the state appropriation. As we displayed in October at $694.1 million this year, without adjusting for inflation, the appropriation remains $14.7 million less than the university received at its peak support of $708.8 million in FY08. Adjusting for inflation using CPI, an appropriation of that level in 08 would have the same buying power as $831.1 million today, which is $137 million more than our actual appropriation for this year. For FY21, we know that the appropriation in law actually increases by the $1,740,000 that Lincoln mentioned, and we know that we have an additional $8 million of incremental new state appropriation from this fiscal year that we chose to hold for recurring commitments in FY21. The total uncommitted increment available for next year's budget is then $9.7 million. Moving to tuition. Our total budgeted tuition revenue for this year is approximately $973 million. Based on recent experience and conversations and the very real need to be responsive to financial challenges really faced by students and families, the university has modest goals related to changes in tuition rates. For resident undergraduate tuition rates, we have worked to hold the rate increases at or below the rates of inflation. This is particularly relevant for our greater Minnesota campuses as they face a very competitive recruitment environment in the region. On pages 88 and 90 of your docket materials, we have included the tuition rates for each of our campuses along with the relevant set of peers for enrollment purposes. Page 89 of your docket materials also displays the NRNR rate for the Twin Cities campus against its Big Ten peers. As you are very aware, our strategy for this rate has differed from that of the resident rate. We have been increasing it significantly for incoming students while holding the rate increases for continuing students to no more than 5.5% each year. This strategy has moved the rate to the middle of the Big Ten group, 8 of 14 this year, a placement that was expressed as a general goal in previous discussions. Finally, the goal for graduate and professional rates has generally been to hold increases to around the rate of inflation, with variations driven by market considerations, student debt load, program rankings, and so forth. For planning purposes, the projected revenue gain from each 1% increase in the various rates is identified on this slide. The question we face is, what should we plan for each of these rate categories? Finally, on the resource side, we need to decide how much reallocation is necessary and appropriate for the FY21 budget. In each of the last 6 years, we have repurposed 1 to 2% of total unit allocations, deciding to reduce or eliminate some expenditures in order to spend the associated resources on something else in the budget. The magnitude has differed by unit based on their needs and opportunities and their unique financial situations. As we heard in the previous presentation, there will always be opportunities to gain efficiencies and lower costs or slow them down. But significant expenditure reductions cannot continue each year without an impact to program and services, potentially jeopardizing our ability to maintain quality and remain competitive. And while I had no idea that the previous presenters were going to say this, my prepared remarks actually say, so clear direction on the desired scope of university activities and tactical goals associated with strategic plans will be important to guide that process of making smart decisions on repurposing our existing resources as we go forward. We know that some level of reallocation will be necessary. The question is how much. Each 1% of the allocation base today yields about $20 million in available resources to redirect to cost increases and other investments. So looking at expenditures now and transitioning to those variables, the first bucket of costs we must consider in balancing the budget contains those items that allow us to maintain the core of our existing activities, so to keep the place running. And the largest cost we have here is the salary and fringe benefit costs of our faculty and staff. We know now that even without a salary increase, we will face an increased cost of $10 million next year just for the growth in our existing fringe benefits with no change in benefit design. And that's in only our framework funds of state appropriation and tuition. For all other funds, that cost increase would be an additional $10 million. An increase in the planned general salary pool averaged across all employees of 1% would cost an additional $12.8 million in framework funds and $11 million in other funds. To be responsive to board policy and provide competitive compensation and reward meritorious performance is our single largest expense increase every year. Beyond that, without making choices to enhance or expand core activities, we face required facility and technology cost increases, as well as compliance-related cost increases. For planning purposes, reasonable estimated increases for these items would be in the $10 to $15 million range. Finally, an important budget variable for any university is what it plans for advancing the work of the institution to the next level in terms of quality, impact, service, and so on. If we could plan for an investment pool beyond costs in the $10 to $20 million range, we would be able to address the high priority items in this bucket. It seems there are never a short supply of good ideas, and so I am not bold enough to put a high end on this range. But in years of more limited resource gains, it's really only the most critical needs and opportunities that can be accommodated in the budget. Choosing higher tuition rate increases or higher reallocation expectations directly does impact the level of new spending that's available in this category. So in summary, pulling it all together, we have laid out the primary budget variables to consider for next year, the resources on the left of this chart and the costs on the right. Although I'm sure you can do the math, the table does identify what each 1 or 2% of tuition rate increase is estimated to generate in all the different categories. Similarly, different levels of internal reallocation and the associated resource yields are identified. And while we didn't really talk about it in depth yet today, in terms of the other revenues, the table also indicates some levels that may be able to contribute to the cost growth on the right side of this slide. If units have uncommitted revenue growth in ICR or sales income, for example, it can sometimes help address these costs. The ability to do this, however, varies by unit, and we work with them during the budget process to leverage those funds as much as possible. That's part of what makes the whole thing more difficult to balance when you look at it from an overall perspective. On the right side, we've identified compensation increase costs only for the framework funds, and then some levels of support for the other categories of spending that are included in the budget. There's really little choice on the low end of these ranges, but depending on resources and priorities, it is possible to either invest or advance the university in those areas as well. The budget process, as I mentioned, is very iterative. Questions lead to more questions and varying decisions until we force the process to arrive at really a balanced state that reflects the president's goals and your goals to the best of our ability. And with that, Mr. Chair, we are finished with our remarks and happy to take questions or have a conversation.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you both. Recognizing that this is, in that last slide that Vice President Tonneson closed with, is in essence a worksheet of sorts that summarizes everything we need to consider, not in the detail we need to, but everything is there, at least the major moving parts. So I commend your work over a long period of time to get us to tools like this. And I would ask the board as we go forward, we've got a bunch of business items to get into in the third hour of our meeting, but we're not going to solve any of these today, and I don't know that we're looking for, direction on substantive issues, but why don't we spend a little bit of time here, 10 to 15 minutes max, quizzing our presenters and providing any feedback we want at this point, knowing we don't have a pending budget decision to make, and knowing, more importantly, that we have a system-wide strategic plan that's got to become the blueprint for investment over a longer period of time. But with that premise, I think Mr. Langworthy's collected a few notes already here. Mr. Regent Simonson, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, presenters. One of my issues, as you've probably heard me, or concerns, say many times, is looking at this current biennial and the $4 billion, whatever it is in that neighborhood, 26% of it tuition, 7% other. It's in that range, and I'm assuming that other is commercialization, licensing in that area included.
Mr. Chair, Regent Simonson, the technology commercialization or the royalty income would be a part of that other green bar, if you will, going back to that chart.
And that's a point. So I'm really looking forward to the strategic plan that I think Vice President Kramer is going to be presenting. And I'm really interested in not just the metrics. I think at the last meeting, they talked about growth in that area that they're going to look at. Mm-hmm. But not just the metrics, but how they are going about putting a value on a technology before it's out licensed. I understand that a lot of it gets out licensed early because of financial concerns, it's at what I call an R1 rather than going out further and getting more value. Mm-hmm. But is your department, your area working with them on that in a strategy that looks at how we could get more revenue, alternative revenue? That's really a concern of mine. I'd rather see that 26% and 7% go like this. So.
I don't know which, or Senior Vice President Burnett, you want to?
Let me take a shot at that. Regent Simonson,
there, so.
That's a really complicated question because there's board policy about where royalty revenues go, and they don't all go to just support the budget of the university. A big chunk of them go to the inventor and the college of what they came from. A part of them do go to support the O&M budget and supporting the Office of Tech Transfer. But as I think we'll get the data for you, it's a really small number compared to the $1 billion in tuition that this university collects on an annual basis. I mean, we're talking 15 million versus $1 billion. So even if we doubled it or tripled it, it's not going to, from my perspective, that's not where we're going to have significant growth that can offset other unrestricted revenue needs within the university's budget. But we do work closely with Tech Transfer, with Chris Kramer's shop, and we certainly look to build incentives to grow that area. I'm just not sure that that's a lever that's going to make a big difference to the overall budget outlook, candidly.
Could I have a quick
follow-up,
follow-up?
Regent Simonson?
How do we compare to other institutions with regard, we have something like 200 patents, that kind of thing, and I think we had 19 startups last year, and revenue of $20 million. To me, that seems not very much.
Senior Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regent Simonson, the last data that I saw and we can get the exact data from you, I believe we're in the top 15 among any research university, public research university in the country for annual revenue from this area. But we can certainly get that and verify it for you. But I don't believe it's an area where we're not competitive in. I believe we are competitive and continuing to look for ways to do that. But a lot of those are investments that take a long time to mature. Drugs or other inventions don't just turn and become big-time royalty income overnight. But I do think under Vice President Kramer and his predecessors, we've tried to build an ecosystem to encourage that. I'm just not sure that that's going to turn the lever in a big way for the operating budget for the university writ large.
Right, Regent Powell.
Thanks, Chairman McMillan. First of all, I do want to thank the presenters for the analysis, because I think the way you've crystallized down to a few core drivers, I find it really, really helpful. I think it helps the board to focus on the things that are most important. And it's a big, complicated budget, so getting it to one page, I think it's really great work. So I have a couple of observations, and they're in Chair McMillan's spirit. I don't think there are answers to these today, but the first one has to do with revenue, and which you identify as it's an opportunity, and we've done some smart things over the last few years. We've with NRNR, and we got the fee program. Those things really they were tactical but really helpful. So I just wonder if there's a way to look at the whole revenue tuition pricing in perhaps using third parties in a more comprehensive and holistic way to help us find other opportunities. I just think we may have to do that, and it's not just about increases. It may be who knows? Maybe there are places where a little decrease would actually help overall enrollment and revenue. So I wonder if there's third party help out there for us. Second point is, I have to say I was surprised, looking at our peer set in the last presentation. I mean, most of our peers are either holding or growing student count, and we're one of the very few that have actually been declining. And I was struck by that. So anyway, you're not going to turn that ship overnight, but if we could even just hold enrollment, it's worth millions of dollars and growing students. Anyway, so I was surprised that a place of this quality is losing students, and our peers are mostly growing. So is that an area of focus? We've talked about efficiencies, and I think everybody knows that that's going to have to be a part of the puzzle here. And then to echo Regent Simonson's comment, and I know that President Gable has a high interest in this. I mean, new sources of revenue would be terrific, but also not an easy thing, but hopefully out there. So a few observations, and thanks for the analysis.
Let's capture those and hang on here with replies while we capture now pretty much the whole board's interested. So let's go to Regent Rocha next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and just the two folks that spoke ahead of me touched on the areas that came to mind as I was reviewing this. First, this is wonderful. I mean, this as Regent Powell just stated. The analysis, the presentation of the data, it really helps us, I think, take the conversation to the next level, and which would be very hard without this kind of presentation. So thank you for that. And I know this has been over a considerable time that you've continued to refine and refine. So I think that's excellent work. On the technology transfer, I just want to make this comment. For me, this is literally a 30-year discussion about how we capture the intellectual property value that's established by an institution like ours compared to a private sector company that invests in research and then very much capitalizes on it. I almost had a career in technology transfer law coming out of clerkship. But I will say that at the time, many years ago, we were talking about this as being the way we were going to fund higher education because we knew that we had an issue with state support. We knew that there was, certainly as a public institution, an artificial and yet real elasticity in tuition, and we were going to fill that gap with this. So it is one of the surprises after a hiatus from the board to come back and see that it really hadn't developed numerically. I mean, financially, it's, I think I share Regent Simonson's, frustration but also hopeful that we can do a better job of capturing this. And so even if we're within our peer group, I think the entire industry of publicly funded research, basic research is obviously different than it was when we were still discovering fairly rudimentary things on behalf of our population. And so now, how do we protect that investment on behalf of the people who are making that investment? I think that's important. But enrollment numbers, that really stands out in this conversation, and Regent Powell could not have set it up better when he talked about what's happening at other institutions. I guess the frustration you'll always have is we're talking about this stuff down here, and when we finally get a handle on it, well, now I want to talk about here, and now I want to talk about here. I want to take this up another level because we've had some really good reports from the administration in the last couple of years about where we stand in these, like the map that shows students out, students in. We are a students out state. And one of the challenges we have is that our other four-year system is not part of our system. And so you're almost got this sort of professional courtesy about knowing that when we increase our enrollment numbers, it impacts all the other institutions within the state. In the 80s, the crisis was the university was serving all these students that really didn't belong at the university and could be better served by other public institutions and then some privates, but primarily this is how the 2+2 system came in, and there was some really great success in improving our graduation rates and providing a better service to students and a better bang for the buck for the taxpayers of the state that were investing in those schools as well as this. Over the last quarter century, the market has really changed. People want to come here. The large comprehensive research university is, that's why we see all of these small rural, particularly the private liberal arts, they're suffering. What role should we play? I think that's a really fundamental question in our strategic planning process, because right now, when you think about it, while we made, we've had some small reduction in student population, but states that are having real losses, in population, where their classes are getting smaller, their schools are staying the same because they're being subsidized by our bodies, and not financially, but pupil subsidy, and they continue to draw more and more of our students. Is it in our best interest financially, keeping tuition down for everybody by looking at saying we're going to take in more of those students? Whether it's more tech at UMD, growth in that regard that keeps those numbers sound. I don't, I'm at a bit of a loss for how to tee this up for us to have that conversation, but I think that is the next 30-year conversation for an institution like the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and system campuses. What should that enrollment be? And I think that we do have to start looking at some of those increases. One, because it's not necessarily the case that if they can't get in here, they're going to go to one of the other state universities in our state. They're going to leave the state. What's the impact on the state, and can some of that managed growth lead to better efficiencies and affordability for Minnesota students? So I think that what you've done is set us up in a great place to have that conversation, and Mr. Chair, I hope that that's something that we can actually get our hands around, because this is, I don't know of a bigger issue that we're going to face on the education side of what we do. Thank you.
Couldn't agree more. Our system-wide enrollment goals have to be front and center in our system-wide strategic plan and how we're going to get there. And there's a slide on page 90 that we don't all need to go to, but if you added the enrollment numbers to the three categories of schools that are shown on that slide, and then through Twin Cities on there, you'd have another piece that would be central to this whole conversation, picking up where Regent Rocha just left off. Student Representative Tosho Garcia.
Thank you, Chair McMillan, and thank you, presenters. Acknowledging that tuition is a subject that concerns both prospective and current students across the University of Minnesota system, what are the deciding factors when it comes to deciding between a 5% increase and a more aggressive tuition hike?
Vice President Tonneson? Or Carlson?
Mr. Chair, Student Representative Tojo Garcia. I think it depends on the year and it depends on the population that we're talking about. But generally speaking, when we look at how much we're going to raise tuition, there's a lot of different things that go into it. The goal would always be to keep it as low as possible. But we take into consideration the demand, the student demand, the availability of student financial aid, so the net price considerations, student debt loads, the impact of employment, so employment opportunities and what that does to the student debt load. All of those things, competitors' rates, what people have to pay if they go elsewhere and who those competitors are. In addition to all of those things are discussed actually even before we start talking about a revenue generation. So it's really about shaping all of those variables in a way that tries to address the needs of the students and still recognizes the need for the tuition at the institution. So it's a combination of all of that. And it varies by student population. If you're referring particularly to the non-resident rate increase that we've embarked on recently, the board has also entered into the conversation around what role the university plays in bringing international and other domestic students to the university, and also the difference in the rate between the resident students and the non-resident students is also come into play in that conversation.
Okay, thank you. I've got 5 regents left that want to speak, and I haven't asked Regent Shu yet. I'm going to go to Regent Beeson next, and please, we are already 5 minutes over, and there's no break. So I don't think we've had a break in this committee since I got the gavel, but I don't know what that tells you. But anyway, we got to keep it moving here, so keep them in the context of input, and we can save questions and answers for later. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, presenters. The issue of technology and commercialization, one of the things that wasn't foreseen when this whole area of discovery happened was that we didn't know that our intellectual property would be stolen. And we all know, it's all public, that we are litigating against out-of-state companies who've ripped us off. And we have to spend millions of dollars to defend our rights to revenue streams. And we will get those revenue streams, but they're unpredictable. And if you look at the money that comes into this university, there's large buckets that come in, but it's every 10 years apart. But that's a big issue, is the theft of our property. Regent Rocha and I have talked a little bit about the allocation of those revenues. I'm generally okay, but this board hasn't talked about those. One of the things I want to make sure is the office that office has enough money. That office is what creates the infrastructure. So if we doubled what they were provided, what would that allow us to do in terms of serving more people? Another point is, tomorrow we're going to be talking about East Gateway. I can't think of a better way to support what Regent Simon was talking about, incubators, major Minnesota companies who are aligned with our mission, than to have that project right across the street. One other point on NRNR, and I got to say, the staff is already sort of equivocating on this. We got to slow down this increase. This is one of the few areas that we can let the market go at it. Mm-hmm. And if we had listened to the staff years ago, we would have, in-state tuition would have gone up 5% more than it is today. So we were right in pushing that hard. I would say, let the data determine this. Let the data drive it. And I'm okay with hitting the wall, and if we find we're raising less money than we were before, we'll back down. But every year we've done this, we've raised more money. The mix has been different, more international students, more national students, fewer students, but less waiver. But at the end of the day, this has been a business decision that has worked. So I just would say, don't slow down until the data tells you to. That's the comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Kenyanya.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, presenters, for the very helpful presentation. My comments are from page 90, which is part of the docket, not part of the presentation. Mr. Chair, you told everyone they don't need to go there. I think they do now. But what I'm seeing here is, so we have the tuition rates for Crookston, Duluth, Morris, and Rochester, along with the Minnesota State four-year universities and the regional universities. And right away you notice that only St. Thomas is higher than our U of M campuses. Besides that, the U of M campuses have the highest tuition. And that also, some of those campuses happen to be where we've seen enrollment challenges. And I feel like there's a correlation. Obviously, the response then is a value conversation, right? If you're comparing Mankato at 8,500 and Morris at almost 14,000, we're saying that there's a difference in that 5,000, whether it's educational quality, access to our research and outreach mission, the brand, et cetera. And I believe that. I've experienced that, and I'm fully bought in on that. But in light of and in considering enrollment numbers, I start to wonder, are we then failing to convey that value to the students, to prospective students? Are they saying, yeah, I don't buy it, that extra $5,000 in cost or student loans is worth it, and that the return is worth it? So just thinking of it in that context, it leads me to believe that the two options are to find different ways to communicate that value and figure out that messaging and how we get people to believe what we believe, that there's a value difference, or what my colleagues have encouraged me to do and listen to the market and adjust that way. And I'm not, arguing for one or the other, but I wonder if I'm thinking of that issue correctly in terms of, who gets to define the value? Do we define it and say you have to believe it, or is the market telling us something about what they believe about the value? I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you, Regent Kenyanya. Regent Mayeron.
I've been focusing on a couple things. One is the enrollment and how that plays a role with both short-term budgeting and long-term planning, and also how the issue of external shocks plays into that. So long-term, we are told that the demographics of our state certainly are changing. There's fewer students who are going to be coming through the pipeline and graduating, and so long-term, we need to be mindful of that and what impact that could have ultimately on our enrollment and therefore revenues from tuition at the university. So that's a global issue. When I look at external shocks, some of them you have addressed by being more conservative in certain areas to take into account what might be an external shock. For example, we don't get as much money from the legislature as we want to get, or health costs go up higher than we've expected. But when I think about enrollment, particularly the issue that has arisen with our international students and what could happen with the significant number of students we have coming in from China, and depending on what happens with immigration policies, that could have an immediate impact on enrollment this year or in the next year, depending on what comes out of the federal government. And so planning for what could be a significant external shock to our revenue side vis-a-vis enrollment within the next year, I think is very important that we have to take into account now. I don't think we can cross our fingers and hope this issue is going to go away. And that's separate from the impact of the coronavirus. I'm just talking about immigration policies and the impact that could have ultimately on our revenues vis-a-vis enrollment.
Thank you, Regent Mayeron and Regent Anderson and Davenport, and then I'll close if Regent Hsu has anything to say. Please be quick.
Thank you, Chair. In the interest of time, my questions have somewhat been answered or can wait. I'll just point out that I appreciate you putting the information in how much revenue we can make on a 1% and where the expenses are. I've kind of whittled it down. We're going to need about $28 million. And I've got it figured out. I just don't want to announce it here today. So I'll let you know. But go ahead. Yeah.
You've got the magic answer. All right. Well, we've been looking for that. Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair McMillan, and my comments might reflect outcomes of all the other comments. If you look at the last slide in the lower right-hand corner on framework funds, I think it's important that we emphasize how we look at the budget balancing, and as we work through the strategic plan, that we focus on how we not just invest, but how we advance the mission. And I think sometimes in a budget process, we lose sight of that. Thank you.
Good comment. Regent Hsu, anything to wrap us up with?
Yes, thank you, Chair McMillan. Just want to amplify on some of the things that my colleagues have already mentioned regarding enrollment. Oh, and by the way, thank you, presenters. This is the best presentation yet on the budget. We're getting questions answered ahead of time that we waited till like the 11th hour in previous years to get. So this is very good information. And I would just like to add that regarding enrollment, we have to talk about admissions. We have to talk about how we admit students across the system. Test optional, obviously, is something that needs to be discussed further. And we do have colleges that are below capacity, and we need to discuss that. We've known that for about 5 years now. We also have the housing guarantee, which I believe is one of the things that actually limits the number of people that we admit and when we admit them. Lastly, tuition, I believe in lower rate tuition and higher NR&R. And when we talk about inflation, we never talk about how we're going to make up for times that we've increased tuition above the rate of inflation. We always talk about the next year, how we want to be in line with inflation. So we never actually catch up. So I'll just leave it there. East Gateway, Rick, you brought it up. Obviously, East Gateway is going to, at some point, remove a lot of housing from the system, and it's not going to add any. So I think that's something we have to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Hsu. Moving on to, and again, you heard a lot of feedback there about the quality and the value of this as a tool that we bring into our budgeting process. So take that to heart. Good stuff. On to item 4, unit reserves policy framework, and Associate Vice President Tonneson's going to stay here and lead this for us. And I want to make a few framing remarks because the title of this, could lead us to want to get into a major policy discussion today. What we had in mind here was listening to board input, and here's where we landed. It really, this item is on our agenda as part of the committee's work plan intentionally, and it's here today to focus on how the administration monitors and manages unit reserves and balances. The discussion is intended to give us a governance level view of that work and provide additional transparency into this element of the administrative process. And I want to note that the institutional balances are included each year as an item in the President's recommended annual operating budget, but we don't spend a lot of time with them. Today's conversation is intended to provide us with the detail that we need to understand what's presented annually, including how the administration watches for early warning signs and problems in a unit at our university. Regent Beeson and I also plan to explore with President Gable and Senior Vice President Burnett how added information on unit reserves and balances could potentially be included with institutional balances as part of the annual operating budget. So use this as information today, but we didn't bring it up despite the title as a conversation about what we might do to policy. It's really just to get everybody on a level set with what we know and what we have. So, Vice President Tonneson.
Mr. Chair, we're having some technical difficulties. I can go ahead without them on the screen.
Why don't you start?
Do
Give
you
us the
have
framework
them before you, or
yeah?
Do you have the slides before you? Okay.
We have
I will just go
those
ahead.
regents that have their iPads open have the slides. If not,
131.
Okay.
Slide 131.
There it is.
Yes. All right,
Go
so
ahead.
moving to slide 132, or page 132.
That's the title slide. Way to go.
Yeah, let's move beyond the title slide. For this conversation, we thought it might be useful actually to start by clarifying what we mean by a few terms. It isn't always obvious that people are on the same page when they're talking about balances or reserves. It's perhaps a subtle difference, but one I believe that is meaningful and important. A balance is in an account is simply unexpended funds on any given day, assuming it is positive for purposes of this conversation. That calculated balance, looks like we are back up, thank you. That calculated balance on June 30th, or the last day of the fiscal year, represents the, quote, carry forward into the next fiscal year. A positive carry forward or balance represents then a non-recurring lump sum of dollars. It's just leftover unexpended revenue. If during the fiscal year the recorded revenue actually equals the recorded expenditures, then that balance remains stable, doesn't grow. If there are more revenues recorded during the year than there are expenditures, that balance that you carried forward grows. If the opposite happens, the balance decreases. So a positive carry forward or year-end balance exists most often because of one of three different, or one actually maybe all three of them, but due to three different things. First, a unit can purposely set aside an amount of revenue to build a reserve. So this is a balance that is turned into a reserve. Funds that are not spent and instead are set aside on purpose to cover a particular purchase in the future or to offset unplanned revenue losses. That's a reserve. A situation can also be in which an annual revenue, as I mentioned, exceeds annual expenditures. So either revenue comes in higher than expected with no expenditure obligations against them, or even if revenues hold, sometimes spending falls short of what was planned in the budget, and there is a balance. The third situation is in which revenues are recorded in a large lump sum all at one time, but the associated spending of that occurs in the next fiscal year or even beyond. An example of this is legislative dollars given for faculty hires. When it might take a year or more to hire all those faculty, a balance will result in that situation. So balances, a reserve is a kind of a balance, if you want to think about it that way. Total balances from a total university perspective are a necessary part of a sound financial model for the institution. Three of the bullets on the left side of this page refer to the importance of total balances in managing cash flow needs and university debt, securing the health of our bank accounts, and ensuring our credit remains strong, thus reducing the cost of debt. In addition, the first bullet refers to the management of total balances through investment. It is the earnings off the investment of these total balances, which we call the temporary investment pool or TIP, that is the primary source of revenue for central reserves, a university level reserve. By board policy, the amount of central reserves held in reserve, so purposely not spent but set aside, is to be $25 million or 4% of the state appropriation, whichever is greater. Some amount of the earnings into central reserves is transferred to O&M, combined with the state appropriation and allocated out to units as part of the budget. Some amount is allocated directly as central reserves through the annual operating budget to units for particular purposes, and the remainder then becomes that board policy reserve and is part of the total balances of the institution. Beyond the balance held in central reserves are the balances held in the units. A balance is actually calculated and reported at every level of the institution. For example, for every college, department, program, activity, and by every fund. Not only do we rely on these balances for the institutional purposes we just discussed on the last slide, but we also rely on them at the unit level for budget management. In our distributed model, we hold the units accountable for the financial activity that occurs there. They are responsible to cover the situations that you see here. And by unit, for budgeting purposes, I mean the Resource Responsibility Center is what we call it. That is the Twin Cities College, a system campus level, or a major support unit level. For example, if tuition comes in lower than anticipated in a particular college, they must reduce expenses or cover them in the short term through the spending of balances. If a unit has to backfill an employee suddenly out on short-term disability, they have to cover that expense until the employee returns. If a unit wants to make a small improvement in their space, it isn't large enough for debt financing, they have to save up unspent funds to cover the cost of that improvement. And if a unit commits one-time funds as part of a faculty startup package, we look to their balances to cover that expense. The point is that the Central University does not manage all of these situations. We do not hold funds for these rather normal operating needs that exist throughout the university. The units are responsible for covering these costs. Relatively small balances or reserves are held in some of the central offices, like the provost's office or the president's office, in order to address critical needs and requests that sometimes come up from the units to perhaps seed investments or deal with particular crises or priorities. But the majority of the one-time expenditures are actually managed at the unit level. That doesn't mean, however, that we don't pay attention and we don't know what's going on from the university level. Very specific to unit level balances, there are 3 primary tracks for monitoring or managing these funds. First, the University Budget Office conducts a comprehensive review of balances at the RRC level every 3 years. We ask the units to report on their balances by assigning every last dollar into a set of standard categories that best describe the purpose of the balance as it existed at fiscal year end. This allows us to describe what the reserves are being held for and to understand what circumstances lead to different balances across the units and to know where there are uncommitted pools of dollars. Second, the balances are what I call actively managed as part of the annual budget process. They are a resource, non-recurring, but nevertheless a resource available for allocation. By unit and by major fund group, we analyze trends in the balances to determine if a structural imbalance issue is developing or not, if there are deficits and how those are offset by positive balances, and where unrestricted balances might be available to address immediate budget needs. Finally, we have a module in our financial system in which units enter their budgets every spring, projecting revenues, expenditures, inter-unit transfers, and carry forward balances. They do this at the very detailed level of the chart of accounts so that for every budgetary structure within the institution, we can run reports, budget and actual, that represent the basic financial model you see in the box in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. This gives us a measure of the units or activities plans and financial health. Part of that active management of balances is depicted here. It is not unusual for university leadership to direct a unit to spend their balances on a particular item raised during the budget process, rather than approve a transfer of any central funding for that purpose. On the opposite end, if the balances are decreasing over time, we work with units to understand why that is happening, whether it represents a purposeful spending of a planned reserve, for example, and therefore doesn't signify a problem, or if it represents spending down of balances on recurring expenses, and that unit will then need to develop a plan and strategy for bringing their revenues and expenditures in alignment. The balances are always monitored, reviewed, analyzed, and factored into our budget decisions. With all this review and the way that the balances are factored into decision making, however, there is no formal policy on what the balances should be, what level they should be. We have discussed and considered this in the past and concluded at various times that a consistent answer to the question or a standard level of balances isn't perhaps appropriate given the different characteristics of the units managing the balances. For example, the Crookston campus with academic and support activities plus all the auxiliary operations and all the facility issues is going to need a different level of total balances than a Twin Cities college that doesn't have auxiliaries and doesn't directly manage their facilities. Or a Twin Cities college that is heavily dependent on tuition revenue for its operations is going to have a different risk profile than a unit that has a much more diversified revenue stream, a set of revenue streams. It might have tuition, sales, grants, ICR, clinical income. There's less risk from a revenue perspective with that diversity. And of course, a revenue-generating unit college, for example, managing multiple programs, is going to have a different need for balances than a support unit like the budget office that budgets only for people, a few supplies expenses, and gets a central allocation to do that. We have very little risk. In our budget, we need very little balance. We do talk about ranges for different types of units that help set expectations and goals, however. For basic support units, for example, we have found balances in the 5 to 10% of expenditure range generally indicate financial health and adequate flexibility for managing their budgets. Some academic units reach that comfort level more in the 15 to 25% range, and still others will trend higher than that due to their reserve plans for future expenditures or the need to manage riskier revenue streams. They all vary a little bit. Therefore, over time, we have found that managing to an appropriate level of balances by unit through our budget and our financial model is more strategic and effective than creating a single policy requirement that would apply more generally to all units. And that, Mr. Chair, concludes my brief remarks on this topic, and I'm happy to participate in a conversation.
We did a nice job in short order, and I'm going to save you the burden of any questions because we're going to keep moving here. As I said at the outset, the opportunity here is to build a level set of understanding around these reserves and how they work with the board, and I welcome all of the committee members to follow up with the board office or directly with you and take the questions there. But this is an element of where we're going. Regent Simonson? A question or a comment?
A comment.
Okay, go ahead.
Quick comment. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate that the unexpected expenses don't come out of Central Reserve. Good example of that is this last year with African swine fever, which is a foreign animal disease threatening the swine around the world, plus other foreign animal diseases. Dr. Jerry Torrenson did a very good job of going to the legislature and getting extra funds that he needed to be able to do better surveillance. So it's just an example. It was a good one.
We've got to be nimble and responsive, and these sort of resources help us do that. Good example, Regent Simonson. All right, we have ahead of us on the agenda now real estate transactions, 3 of those, 3 collective bargaining agreements, an item on KUMD that Chancellor Black needs to update us on, and a fairly substantial consent agenda. So that's why you see me driving a little bit here and pushing, but we have Assistant Vice President Krieger here to talk to us about the next item before us, which is review and action on 3 parcels of real estate.
Chair McMillan, members of the committee, good morning, and I'm here to request board review and action on the proposed acquisition of 3 properties, 818 Essex Street Southeast, 824 Essex Street Southeast, and 510 Ontario Street Southeast in Minneapolis. These 3 properties are located across the street from the Oak Street parking ramp and the Clinics and Surgery Center. The university already owns the southern 3/5 of this block, which is used as surface parking to support the CSC. It is on this parking lot that the university plans to construct the proposed clinical research facility. The university is seeking to acquire these properties and additional land on this block in order to give more flexibility to the design of the CRF. However, if we are unable to acquire additional property, the university will construct a taller tower on our currently owned land and use these 3 parcels for construction staging in the near term and open space or parking in the longer term. The total purchase price for the subject properties will be a little over $2.9 million, which is consistent with the appraised values of the property. The university is requesting funding as part of the university's 2020 state capital request in order to assist with the acquisition of these properties and for the design of the CRF building. The university will issue debt to fund its share of the purchase or the entire purchase if the state does not support the funding request. Because these properties currently house students, the owners wish to continue operations. We have structured the purchases to also include both short-term and long-term ground leases. The details regarding these ground leases can be found in your docket materials. Thank you.
Very good. So the intent here is to take all of these as a group and approve them and the resolutions there. So I'd open by seeing if there's a motion to bring this before the board, or before the committee. Sorry. Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Very good. Moved and seconded. Now let's see if there's any discussion. Seeing none, I'm going to call for a vote. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Very good. Well done. And congratulations on that continuing exercising that strategy or executing that strategy. That brings us to Interim Vice President Horstman. Welcome to the Finance and Operations Committee, and you have, I think it's 3 labor agreements for us today. So you can lay the groundwork for those, and then I believe we're going to take each of those independently.
Thank you, Chair McMillan, Regents, student representatives. Today we bring forward 3 agreements which cover our labor represented employees represented by the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, or AFSCME Council 5. These agreements have been negotiated and cover 1,518 clerical and office support employees represented by Local 3800 and 3801, the 708 technical employees represented by Local 3937 and 3801, and the 204 healthcare and non-professional employees represented by Local 3260. The employees covered work throughout all of our campuses, research and outreach centers, and each agreement is a 2-year contract covering the contract period effective July 1st, 2019 through the end of the contract period, June 30th, 2021. Our settlement across all 3 agreements includes a 2.25% salary range adjustment for all employees, in addition to steps in all classifications in the first year of the contract. For clerical and office support and healthcare and non-professional employees, this 2.25% in the first year is retroactive to December 23rd, 2019. For the technical employees, it is retroactive to June 24th, 2019. The second year of this contract, employees in all classifications will receive a 2.25% salary range adjustment in addition to steps effective July 1st, 2020. The parties reached tentative agreement on December 11th, and the union's contract ratification process was completed recently on January 21st. I would like to recognize the negotiating team members from AFSCME and the university, the AFSCME field representatives and local officers, the university chief negotiators, and the AFSCME represented university employees for their diligence and commitment in reaching these agreements. With that, we ask for your approval of each of these 3 agreements before you. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Vice President Horstman, and thanks to those at the university that have been involved, both from the union side and from the leadership side, in bringing us to conclusion here. So I'm going to start with the AFSCME Council 5 agreement and ask the clerical and office units, locals 3800 and 3801, and ask if there's a motion to approve. Very good.
Second.
Moved and seconded. That resolution's before you. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Thank you, Regent Hsu and everyone. That is adopted, 3800 and 3801. Now moving on to the healthcare and professionals unit, local 3260. Is there a motion to approve?
So move.
Second. Second. Moved and seconded. Discussion on that contract. Hearing none. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries. And AFSCME Council 5, the technical unit locals 3937 and 3801. Is there a motion to adopt that resolution?
So moved. Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion. All right, we'll vote. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That carries, and thank you very much. Now we can invite Regent Black, Regent Chancellor Black. Now, we've tried to make a consultant and a chancellor into a regent today, so. Oh, and as Regent Swiggum pointed out, none of those are really promotions, are they? Sorry about that. I'm reading my list of things to do and looking down instead of looking up. Chancellor Black, welcome to the Finance and Operations Committee. And you're here to bring a matter to us for our consideration related to the sale of KUMD.
Good morning, Chair McMillan, President Gable, and Senior Vice President Burnett, as well as Board of Regents members. With respect, I decline that promotion. But thank you. Thank you very much for that. And especially thank you for your consideration of the letter of intent that's in your docket and for speaking with me today. For 63 years, UMD has operated KUMD Radio, which offers music and local programming and is a very active part of Duluth's arts and music scene. And although I enjoy KUMD quite a bit and appreciate its many contributions to our community, our campus community, and the larger community, it has become increasingly difficult for us to provide much needed O&M financial support for the ongoing operation and maintenance of KUMD and its broadcasting equipment. Paid staff have unfortunately been reduced to a minimal level of 5, and critical, expensive broadcasting equipment is well beyond the end of its useful life. While students play a role in KUMD and run the overnight programming, the station does not operate as a solely student-run station, such as KUOM Radio K on the Twin Cities campus. About 2.5 years ago, the Duluth Superior Area Educational Television Corporation, or as we locally refer to it, WDSE, approached us about the possibility of purchasing KUMD. WDSE, which is actually located on the UMD campus, is a highly respected and long-standing local public television station whose vision is to be essential to the communities it serves. Over the past 2 years, we have negotiated the sale of the station and equipment after much careful thought and consideration of many options. And as a result, in your docket materials, we present you with a letter of intent describing the terms of that sale. Instead of us selling KUMD's broadcasting license to a commercial entity, this transaction retains a local public radio presence in Duluth, Superior, and Northeast Minnesota. WDSE understands and honors the community commitment that has been a long-standing tradition of KUMD. Now, once this letter of intent is approved, there's still much work to be done. We would negotiate terms of a definitive asset purchase agreement and prepare the appropriate documents needed to gain approval from the Federal Communications Commission to transfer the license. So today I ask for your approval of this letter of intent. I believe what we are proposing to you today is the best solution for KUMD, is in the best interests of UMD, and establishes a unique and I think exciting community partnership between UMD and WDSE. The letter of intent comes with an offer of employment for current UMD employees. And this new partnership will provide internships, research and creative opportunities for UMD students and faculty in a new broadcast environment that combines television and radio and focuses on new media trends. It preserves and aligns public radio in Duluth and Superior with a public media entity that can better resource KUMD and better serve our community. So thank you very much for your time. I'm available to answer any questions you might have. I'd also like to mention that here today, joining us is Ms. Patty Mester, the President and General Manager of the Duluth Superior Area Education Television Corporation. She's here to show her support for this letter of intent. Also, Greg Brown from the Office of General Counsel is here. Greg has been extremely important and helpful to me in negotiating this letter of intent. So thank you.
Thank you, Chancellor Black, and I'll double down on your thanks to President Mesker for being here and showing her support, and to the two of you with obviously lots of help, but finding a path forward that at least looks to this region like a sustainable way to keep a very treasured asset going forward that we alone probably cannot sustain. So I'll open it up for questions to Regent Black. There, I did it again, Chancellor Black. Steve, Regent Swigum, you got me on a bad course here today, so we got to stop this. And we're going to start with Regent Mayron. And there I got the Regent part right. So.
Thank you, Chair McMillan. I just have some questions about the terms of the proposed transaction. I apologize, I didn't have an opportunity to contact you in advance and probably could have gotten those questions answered then. So let me just walk through them. I'm looking at what shows up in our materials at page 162 and 163. The first question has to do with paragraph 1, where it says all liabilities of KUMD as of the date of the transaction shall remain liabilities of UMD. The first question is, what liabilities are we talking about? The second question has to do with the ground lease for, which apparently is the land lease rental of $1 per year. What's the kind of the backstory to that? And because apparently we're going to continue at renting the ground lease is going to be $1 per year. So how did we arrive at that figure? And then the third question had to do, these are both coming out of paragraph 9 on the lease agreements. We talk about a facility lease of approximately $12 per square foot. And is that market, or how do we arrive at that? Because apparently we're going to be locked in for a 3-year period, at least on that per square foot charge. So those are my questions regarding the terms of the lease.
Chancellor Black.
Lease agreement.
Chair McMillan, Regent Mayron, and members of the board, I might ask Greg Brown to join me at the table, just in case I say something stupid. I'd rather have counsel next to me. But
always wise.
I believe I can handle all this. But
Thank you, Chancellor Black.
thank you. The liabilities, I believe there is a paragraph that just clears the deck for us to make sure that we're not transferring anything to WDSE in a liability range that we should. There will not, to my knowledge, be any significant liabilities left. Obviously, we will deal with the employees in an appropriate way. One of the nice things about this letter of intent is, as I said earlier, it does come with an offer of employment from WDSE. However, since they are university employees, we will need to terminate them as university employees, which means there will be severance considerations for them depending upon their years of service. And so that could be a potential liability that we will cover and make sure is cleared in the sale. How am I doing with that so far?
That sounds just fine.
Perfect. So, and also, let me see if I can.
There was the ground lease.
Ground lease, yes.
$1 a year, and
Yes.
then the $12 per square foot for the facilities rent lease, I think.
Correct, thank you. The ground lease is something that, as it references in your document materials, was created back in the 1970s when this public television station was first established on our campus. And if I remember correctly, it was like a 100-year lease. But with this change and with some intended renovations that WDSE intends to make in their facility, we thought, on the advice of council, that this would require a renegotiation of that lease. But we also signaled in the letter of intent our commitment to keeping the monetary amount of the lease at the current level. We didn't want them to be concerned that we were going to renegotiate and charge an exorbitant amount for the lease. But that's the backstory. It's been in existence since the 1970s. But because of the transaction and because of the fact that WDSC's facilities most likely will be changed, added to on our campus, there was a need to renegotiate. 2 for 2, okay. And the third was
the $12.
$12, yes.
We're committing to for the next 3 years.
Correct. That's about half of the going rate that we look at, which is, I believe, if I'm correct, is around $25 per square foot. But that was something we negotiated with them throughout this process, and we went back and forth on that item as well as most items in the letter of intent. But we were trying to do what we could to ease the transition for WDSC, since they have considerable expenses involved in making this transition and doing it in such a way that would help them but would also not harm UMD. So that's how we ended up with that amount.
Thank you.
Regent Kenyanya.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Chancellor Regent Black, or whatever. I have a comment and then a question. First comment is just happy to hear that employment offers will be extended to the current staff. That's very good to hear. And then I understand this is just a letter of intent, and I'm sure details are still yet to be ironed out. But we're talking about the back end and the details and the contracts, but on the front end, what will that experience look like? And how will it or will it not change in terms of if you're a student that's engaged with KUMD or some of the overnight broadcasters or a community member? What do we know about what that experience will be like?
Chancellor Black.
Thank you, Chair McMillan and Regent Kenyanya. First of all, nothing's going to change for quite a while. Because as indicated, once you all approve, I hope you will approve the letter of intent, then it kicks in another series of things that have to happen. There's a due diligence period. There's another major agreement. There's FCC approval. So in the meantime, we'll keep operating the station as normal until everything is final. So the students will not be impacted until that's done. Beyond that, obviously responsibilities for specific activities for students, faculty, et cetera, will shift to the new owner of the station. I've had extensive talks with Patty Mester about this issue, and what I continue to hear from her is a sincere interest in continuing student involvement, and in fact, perhaps in a new way, because they'll be dealing with mixed media, combined media. So we hope over time there'll be increased opportunities for them that could be even more helpful than what they have now. But I really don't have, I can't give you today exactly what those are going to be because those would yet to be determined. But as you can see from our talk about space on campus and leasing space, et cetera, even beyond the approval of the sale of the station, even though it will be owned by this other entity, will still be operating on our campus for a while until they make their physical improvements that they need to fully incorporate it into their operations.
And Regent Swigum.
Mr. Chairman, I'll pass.
I'll pass. Other questions from the board?
Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Regent Hsu. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Chancellor Black. Could you explain how we got the purchase price? Was there an appraisal on the station at that point? Also, what will be the annual cost savings taking into account the one-time severance payments or other costs? And then, are there any plans to change the call sign, or can you even change the call sign of the station?
Chancellor Black, did you follow all that?
I did not hear the middle part, Chair McMillan. I apologize.
Regent Hsu, can you just restate that? Sorry, it was a little broken up here.
I'm sorry. Thank Chair McMillan. I believe the middle part was about what the annual cost savings will be for the station, taking into account the one-time severance payments.
So purchase price, cost savings,
Call signs.
And what?
Call sign.
Call signs, there you go.
Well, in terms of the purchase price, as indicated in the docket materials, as we were exploring all options over the last more than 2 years, we did engage a commercial broker to just see what the overall value might be on the commercial market for the license. The information that we got back from the broker was that could be approximately $350,000. However, the broker has a 25% fee associated with it. So even if we could have had a $350,000 commercial sale price, the amount coming to us would be around $262,000. The other piece of this, as indicated, there are many equipment costs, most expensive of which would be the transmitter for the station, that would be extremely expensive for us to have to replace. But given all factors, and again, there was quite a bit of negotiation back and forth between us and WDSE over the last couple of years, and we finally settled on the price that we did, that we felt was fair and reasonable. As I said earlier, it does have a lot of advantages for us in terms of preserving high-quality public radio. Most likely, if we had sold it to a commercial entity, it obviously would not have been public radio. It would have been sold for other purposes, and I think that would have been a real loss for the Duluth Superior area, as well as northeastern Minnesota. I think it would have been a real loss for our students who have been engaged with KUMD over the years. So that's basically the process we used in agreeing our determining a purchase price that we could both agree with. In terms of the call letters, I really can't quite answer that question. That also would be up to the new owners. We've not had real discussions about that. And even if the call letters change, the new owners have indicated an interest in continuing to indicate that they're broadcasting from the campus of the University of Minnesota Duluth. So I hope that can be done, and they obviously are right there among us. So my hope and intention is that there will always be a UMD identity associated with this radio station, as well as now with the combined TV and radio operation.
Regent Hsu, did we get to the three parts of your question?
I don't think I heard the response to the cost savings, annual cost savings.
Oh, and I'm sorry, annual cost savings.
Chancellor Black.
Well, for UMD, the cost, I don't have a figure for you because the cost savings would be in general financial support that we've been providing the station in terms of accounting services and some other things. We don't have a lot of O&M savings because we've backed out most of the O&M already from the station. There would also be some cost savings perhaps for us in terms of what would happen with the equipment that needs to be replaced. I don't have a figure on that for you. We could get you an estimate if that's important. But given the transmitter that I mentioned, a lot of the other equipment that's old and at end of life, obviously there'll be a savings in us not having to replace it. But that's probably the best guesstimate I can give you on that off the top of my head.
All right, thank you, Chancellor.
How about
Regent Hsu, a follow-up?
Yeah, sorry, Chair McMillan. How about an annual cost savings for the employees?
Chancellor Black, cost savings for the employees, I think was the question.
Right. I don't have that figure off the top of my head. I apologize. I can also get that for you. We're talking about 5 employees plus fringes. But most of their costs right now are covered through grants and contributions. Since we've been backing out the O&M contribution to the station, most of those costs in the recent past, last couple of years anyway, have been covered by the contributions to the station, as well as other granting agencies.
Okay. I don't see any other hands coming up here. So we will take this up again at our next meeting in March and bring it to a likely conclusion at that point. Thank you, Chancellor Black, and thank you, Director Brown, for your able assistance throughout this. That brings us to the consent report, which today includes Central Reserve's general contingency, purchase of goods and services of $1 million or more, amendments to the civil service rules, 5 employment agreements, 2 capital budget amendments, 1 real estate transaction, and 1 schematic design. So before I ask members, before I ask for any potential separation of items out of that combined consent docket, are there any questions we want to ask? And then I'll give a chance to separate if anybody wants to. Regent Rocha.
Mr. Chair, I wanted to make a comment regarding the employment agreements. It wouldn't necessarily require them to be pulled out of the consent agenda, although that is how a consent agenda works. So I would leave it to your discretion whether I should just make the comment now or pull them out and make the comment.
Why don't you make the comment now?
I will do that, Mr. Chair. Thank you. I just want to talk about, we have some contracts that in our athletics department, and I want to make a comment so as to maintain credibility for the fact that we talk about contracts of a substantial amount, and by not commenting, I don't want to give the wrong impression that this isn't important and significant. I think that talking about them as a group, the revenue generated by the department is obviously critical to our capacity to retain folks that are able to put together a competitive program. These are, by average folk standards, substantial compensation rates. But I think that, my assessment is, having observed this for as long as I have, that we are in a very positive trajectory right now. And speaking specifically to the athletic director contract, we have seen now the program doing very well, is taking less money, is by the reports that we've received, not taking money out of our core mission to perform the functions of the department, which is obviously very visible to the public and what most Minnesotans associate first with the institution. Whether appropriate or not, that's the reality. And the one thing I would say, as I was reviewing, there's the academic and there are the athletic incentives in that contract. As the basis for the compensation rates for these various individuals is reflective of the market-driven component of the department and the department generating revenue, I would like to consider for future contracts. This one obviously is formed as it is, but if we could put financial performance as part of the incentives, particularly as it would relate to generating revenue that would come back to the academic and other core missions of the university. I think it's already kind of in there. I mean, as we sort of look at how the performance works, but I would be perfectly comfortable, not even necessarily in replacing the compensation, but adding an additional incentive to be able to generate revenue that would then support the other things that the university does. And I also, the only other comment that I would make is, when you talk about head coaches, I think there is even that capacity to reward for success, and there are a lot of things coaches can do to drive attendance at the various sporting events to generate revenue. When you get past the head coaches, I think it becomes a little bit more difficult. So I just want to say that to the folks that have concerns about these types of compensation rates compared to what we're able to do for other folks within the institution, there is a very different sort of mechanism for how we end up in these positions. And I would just say that I think that the folks that we have been doing a fantastic job. They've been accountable, they're being successful, and in future contracts I would like to see that. Rewarding the institution with money back to our core mission as part of the contracts, I think would be something that would be valuable. That's it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. Our governance and policy expert, Mr. Langworthy, assures me that board policy does make it okay for us to comment on items in the consent report before pulling them out individually. So this is the time for those. I see Regent Beeson has his hand up. I'm gonna add to what you just said. I think there is considerable and growing interest among the board and probably across higher ed for more incentive-based compensation, and if the department's in the black and contributing back to what we're trying to do here, that's worthy of incentive compensation consideration. So I even think we left a placeholder in our president's contract for those types of things. We didn't fill it in, but I recall that we contemplated it at some length. So, across the leadership positions in this organization, I wholly support a look at more opportunities where appropriate, because it's not easy, but incentive-based and reward-based compensation when it aligns with outcomes that we want. So thank you for those comments, Regent Rocha. Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do support the proposed contracts. What jumped out to me was the minuscule amount of incentive to drive academic progress by the players. I think it was $2,500 in one of the coaches' cases. I think that, and I know there's more incentives in for the AD, but as it relates to the coaches, I think they need to have a bigger stake in the outcome of the students that hits them in the pocketbook.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Some feedback there for our president and our athletic director and our CFO and everyone else that you can all take into consideration. But I'm not, now I'm going to ask, is there any element of the consent agenda across the items I highlighted, capital budget amendments, real estate, employment agreements, schematic designs, that anybody wants to remove from the consent agenda? All right, seeing none then, I would like to entertain a motion to recommend approval of the consent report.
Move it.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, discussion on the consent report as it stands. Seeing no hands and hearing no discussion, I'm going to call for the vote. All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Thank you, Michael. We caught that. And that brings us to information items. And that is an opportunity for Senior Vice President Burnett to walk us through any items you want to highlight for our attention and consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the board, there's a number of reports that you can find starting in page 268 of the docket that I think are of interest to you about our risk management program, our finance and debt management work, of course, the quarterly purchasing report. And I'd also highlight the results of the 2019 Employee Engagement Survey, meeting the goals of this board on one of your maroon and gold standards. We've continued to trend upward in the employees taking the Employee Engagement Survey and actually the actual results of employees across our organization being engaged. It's not just about taking the survey, it's also about how they're feeling about their work. And I think that you hopefully can take a look at that and see that I think there's some really good trends. And that's a lot of work by a lot of folks across this organization, statewide. So I encourage you to take a look at the employee engagement report. We do that on a every other year basis to avoid survey fatigue. But I think there's some promising trends there that has been a longstanding measure of success from this board. Thank you.
Regent Powell, did I see
Thank you. Thanks, Chair McMillan. Just a couple of questions for Senior Vice President Burnett and a comment. Well, first of all, thanks and appreciation for the capital management over a long period of time and very high ratings that we've received from our agencies and the work to retire higher cost debt over time. So the question is, and we have another opportunity I think coming up, but do you see, are there going to be continued opportunities to refinance? And we're sitting at 3%, and 2 is kind of the number now. So the question is, will there be other opportunities? That's one question. The second thing is just a comment. In the insurance review, there was a comment made that we're asking our insurers to offer opinions, thoughts, advice on risk management. I think that's a really good practice. These guys see what goes wrong, in our kind of institution across the country, and getting that kind of feedback and incorporating it into the chief auditor's thoughts, and Chair Rocha, who chairs the audit committee. I just think it's a really good practice, and I wanted to call it out. We can learn from those insurers about where our risk is.
Senior Vice President Burnett on the retirement opportunities ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Regent Powell, yes, absolutely. We continue to look for ways to reduce obviously lower cost of capital, lower operating expenses, and we'll continue to look at those. Generally, public debt, like what we issue, is on a 10-year call cycle, and most investors take the yield to call, not the yield to maturity numbers when they look at it. So they're expecting us to call it if it's in our favor. So yes, the Biodiscovery District is the latest round, but we've got some other debt coming up, so we are going to continue to look at it. To your point about the risk management and getting outside perspective is absolutely right on. In fact, I've had preliminary conversations with Deloitte, who's our external auditor, about another quality assurance piece about as we build a more robust enterprise risk management program that President Gable wants us to put together, about Deloitte stepping in. One, they're a trusted partner of this board, and two, they do this for other corporations worldwide. So I think that if you vector in from both our carriers and from our external auditor, I think then we get a much more robust look at where we might be missing some things.
Good, thank you.
Other questions or feedback? Regent Mayeron.
Just a quick question about the survey on faculty and staff that's here. I noticed that in terms of participation, the faculty percentage participating in the survey is lower than staff, and has been for the last since 2015-17 and in 2019. Any explanation as to why the difference between staff and faculty, why faculty's participation rate is lower than staff?
Senior Vice President Burnett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Regent Marion, it might be helpful if the provost wanted to join me on that question, but I think that's not unnatural for a university, for the faculty to have so many things going. Many of them are on sabbatical or doing their research in other parts of the world. That's one of our challenges, is that they're just a lot more fluid. A lot of them are physicians. We just don't see the value. We continue to try and encourage our managers to encourage participation. I guess I'd point out the trend is working up for faculty participation. We've made it a big piece of what we'd like them to comment on, but I don't think it's unsurprising to have our faculty see that as less of valuable use of their time compared to the other things that they're trying to do, and I don't think that'd be outside the norm for a university of our size, but we can get that data for you.
I see Vice President Horstman there. You had anything to add? You can be quick.
Thank you,
though.
Chair McMillan. I'd like to introduce Brandon Sullivan, our Director for Leadership and Talent and Training Development, who runs the engagement survey. He can answer that for you.
Welcome, Mr. Sullivan. You can be quick, and because we're just about to wrap up, but welcome to the committee.
Yeah, thank you, Chair McMillan, Regents. It's not unusual for faculty to respond at slightly lower rates than staff to an engagement survey. I would echo the comments. We've seen increases, actually pretty significant increases in responses over time, which typically demonstrates that faculty and staff are seeing value in the survey. They're seeing it's worth their time to answer the questions because it leads to improvements, it leads to results. And I would point out that the other university I'm aware of that is like ours, that does a survey like this, the University of Iowa, gets a 60% response rate overall, lower for faculty. So we're well beyond that. So that's maybe a bragging point for us. We actually have pretty strong participation in the survey for faculty.
All right, quick follow-up, Regent Mayeron. I've got one other regent here with questions.
Yes. Do you break it out by campus to see how faculty and staff are, not only participation, but more importantly, how they're responding? And we're trying to measure basically satisfaction with the respective institutions that they work with. So do you break it out by campuses?
Director Sullivan.
Yes. So the results of the survey are reported where there's a minimum N of 5 responses. So it goes all the way down to manager level, where there are at least 5 faculty or 5 staff responses. So there are actually several hundred faculty and staff in management roles who get results for their department, college, or unit. And it is also broken out by campus. So we share the data. The data is shared so that it can be acted on at the local level.
And do you see, as a follow-up, do you see differences among the campuses on these kind of satisfaction surveys?
Yes, so the engagement survey that we use is designed to measure a whole variety of things that get at the quality of the work environment, as well as commitment and dedication. And that's a very local story typically. So it varies a lot based on what's happening at the local level. So yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. Regent Beeson, finish us up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Regent Powell's questions reminded me that we've got a series of these advisory committees, debt and investment, namely, and these are the best and brightest people in town from the public and private sectors who I know add value. And it makes me wonder whether we should have one in for risk management in place or for benefits. I would just encourage the managers to look at that. I know it takes some time, but the value that the managers get out of having people in the community meet with them regularly it's invaluable.
Well said. Before I adjourn or ask for a motion to adjourn, I just am struck by the fact that the information items portion of our agenda typically gets severely shortchanged, and the bottom line is, the business of the university is included in what we see there. So I'll do a better job trying to leave some time as the questions at the tail end of this conversation. We get so caught up in the transactional nature of everything we're doing here that we don't take time to realize that chunk of this agenda is the bulk of what happens around here, whether it's engagement surveys, debt refinancing, whatever. It's important, and know that the board appreciates that. And I'm grateful to the committee for a very, very good set of discussions today, and to the leadership team of President Gables for all the material that came before us. So with that, is there a motion to adjourn?
Second.
That's sort of hesitant, you want to go late or what? Are you just used to me being late? All right, we stand adjourned.